Hello and welcome to the Carboncopies Workshop on Metaphysics and Ethics of Whole Brain Emulation. For those of you who have joined us for previous events, this is a mini workshop with a different focus. It's a smaller event, and we wanted to do something with more direct interaction with the community, including new satellite gatherings. This is going to be less technical and focused more on bigger picture questions, like what is the natural outcome of neuroscience? What is the neuroscience of conscious awareness? What do we mean by personal identity? We'll start today with a talk on how to approach the topic of consciousness from a scientific perspective by Dr. Michael Cerullo of the Brain Preservation Foundation. Take a short break. Then we'll have a panel discussion on personal identity and whole brain emulation, which will include questions from the audience. So thanks to all those of you who've submitted questions in advance. And additional questions are, of course, welcome on our Q&A form. So moving on, Dr. Michael Cerullo of the Brain Preservation Foundation has been kind enough to record a talk for us today entitled How to Construct a Well-Constrained Theory of Consciousness. Now, one of the perks of volunteering Carboncopies is getting a sneak previews for things like this, so I can tell you this is a tremendously exciting talk. After the two-part talk, Dr. Cerullo is also here to do a live Q&A with us. So again, any questions that anybody has, please submit on the Q&A form, and we should be ready to go.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking about how to construct a well-constrained theory of consciousness. And specifically here, what I mean is a scientific theory of consciousness. I'm going to split this talk up into two parts, and I've actually made separate recordings, so we don't have to do part two if we don't have time. And I tried to keep part one with a minimal amount of philosophy and just kind of presenting the gist of the theory. Just a little bit about a background about myself, for those of you who may not know me. I was in academic medicine for about 10 years studying cognitive neuroscience, specifically affective neuroscience. But I've always had an interest in consciousness and identity. In fact, I think that was my main interest, so I'm no longer in academic medicine, but I still have a major interest in consciousness. And luckily, I'm still able to do some of that research and publish and work with groups like the Brain Preservation Foundation and now Carboncopies. So, oops, here we go. So what I'm going to propose is that physical consciousness is what matters for scientific theory of consciousness. Of course, I have to obviously explain physical consciousness, and I think that's what part one is all about. And so to create a good scientific theory of consciousness, we need to have a scientific definition of consciousness. And the physical consciousness is going to be my scientific definition. So now I want to go through some definitions of consciousness just to get us started. One of the more famous definitions is by the philosopher John Searle. Consciousness refers to those states of sentience and awareness that typically begin when we are awake from a dreamless sleep and continue until we go to sleep again or fall into a coma or die or otherwise become unconscious. A very popular definition. It captures, I think, the intuitive understanding of consciousness for a lot of people. Similar sort of intuitive definition from Roger Penrose, his 1989 book, Emperor's New Mind. I more or less know when I'm conscious, and I take it that other people experience something similar or corresponding to what I experience. To be conscious, I seem to have to be conscious of something. Here's Francis Crick from the book Astonishing Hypothesis. Everyone has a rough idea of what is meant by consciousness. And here he suggests it's better to avoid a precise definition because of the dangers of a premature definition. And we're going to come back to that point later. Phenomenal consciousness is experience. What makes a state phenomenally conscious is that there's something it is like to be in that state. Ned Block, sort of echoing Thomas Nagel's definition, which we're going to talk about later as well. Here's Max Vellman's this everyday understanding of consciousness based on the presence or absence of experience phenomenon provides a simple place to start. So this seems maybe like a tautology, but this actually I think is a very important definition, and we're going to definitely come back to that one. Here's Daniel Dennett. The challenge to construct a theory of mental events is using the data that scientific method permits. Such a theory will have to be constructed from third-person point of view, since all science is constructed from that perspective. And Dennett termed this the heterophenomenology. Again, we're going to come back to that point. Here's Bernie Bars, who's famous for the global workspace theory of consciousness. Consciousness seems to be the publicity organ of the brain. It is a facility for assessing, disseminating, and exchanging information, and for exercising global coordination and control. Christoph Koch has a similar type of definition. Consciousness gives access to a general purpose and deliberate processing mode for planning and contemplating a future course of action. And again, here is, I want to return to Christoph Koch, who in his book on consciousness suggested that, maybe we need to combine aspects from multiple definitions. We've got the common sense definition, again from Searle, consciousness begins when we wake up in the morning and goes until we fall in a dreamless sleep. A behavioral definition, we could come up with a checklist of actions or behaviors that would certify as conscious any organism that could do one or more of them. Neuronal definition, looking at the minimal physiological mechanisms required for one conscious sensation. The philosophical definition, what it's like to have experience. And he left this out, but I think you need a fifth definition at the level of the cognitive neuroscience, and you can either use definition similar to the Koch's that I listed previously, or Bernard Barr's definition. So now I want to get back to physical consciousness, and I think the key here is looking at first person versus third person views or definitions of consciousness. And I think we could split the above definitions into two groups, first and third person. Obviously Dennett's definition, Bernard Barr's, Christoph Koch's later definition were all third person definitions, and Searle and some of the other intuitive definitions were first person definitions. So I want to take a quick philosophical interlude here just to provide definitions for supervenience and physicalism. So first, supervenience, and this is a definition from the philosopher Kem. The mental supervenes on the physical, and that things, objects, events, etc., that are exactly alike in all physical properties cannot differ with respect to mental properties. That is, physical indiscernibility entails psychological indiscernibility. And I don't think this is at all controversial. And again, here's another way to say this by the philosopher John Searle. All mental phenomenon, whether conscious or unconscious, visual or auditory, etc., all of our mental life are caused by processes going on in the brain. And again, I think this is assumed by all neuroscientists. I'm not sure you could find a neuroscientist that would disagree. And here's Francis Crick, again from the Astonishing Hypothesis, stating your joys, your sorrows, memories, etc., are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And this is a good transition because this assumes supervenience, but it also gets into physicalism. which is a lot stronger assumption than supervenience. In physicalism, the doctrine that all things that exist are entities recognized by the science of physics or systems aggregated out of such entities. And again, physicalism is a lot stronger. And in what follows, I'm actually not going to make any assumptions that require physicalism, but instead simply supervenience. And of course, what I say certainly could be used to support physicalism, but I want to separate that and the assumptions. So let's get back to physical consciousness. Again, we talked about first and third person consciousness, so let's maybe provide some more specific definitions of these two concepts. And I mentioned I'd return to Thomas Nagel, his famous definition of what it's like to be a bat. The consciousness, first person consciousness, is the what it's like. And I think, but we also saw definitions like John Searle, any of those intuitive definitions. And here's David Chalmers talking about first person data. They concern the subjective experiences of conscious systems. It is a datum for each of us that such experiences exist. We can gather information about them by attending to our own experiences and by monitoring verbal reports about others. These phenomenological data provide the distinctive subject for the science of consciousness. Now I'm going to disagree with that last point, so we'll come back to that. But I think a key point for what I'm going to be talking about, and this gets into a lot of the controversy in the study of consciousness, is that I'm not going to make a big effort to deny first-person consciousness. I'm going to talk about that more in part 2, but ultimately I'm going to leave first-person consciousness to metaphysics and focus on third-person consciousness. And I think all these terms about first-person consciousness I think could be viewed as introducing a primitive term into our vocabulary, which must be taken as a given. Again, I'm not really going to spend any time denying those concepts. But what I am going to do is focus on third-person consciousness as what we need to focus on. And in his paper, the 2004 paper, this was actually from a textbook on the cognitive neurosciences on how to study consciousness. And in that paper, actually, Chalmers never defined third-person consciousness, which I thought was an interesting point. Rather, he defines third-person data as a data that concern the behavior and brain processes of conscious systems. These behavioral and neurophysiological data provide the traditional material of interest for cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. I think a lot of people would agree with that. He gives several examples of third-person data, including perceptual discrimination of stimuli, integration of information, access to internally represented states, reportability, etc. And then states that to explain third-person data, we need to explain the objective functioning of a system. For example, to explain perceptual discrimination, we would need to explain how a cognitive system can perform the objective functioning of distinguishing between two stimuli. Again, I don't think anything he said there was too controversial. The task of a science of consciousness is to systematically integrate two key classes of data into a scientific framework. Third-person data, or data about behavior and brain, and first-person data about subjective experience. And here is where I think a key point of this talk is that I think this approach is incorrect and ultimately counterproductive to the scientific study of consciousness. And to see this, I think we need to show that we can provide a straightforward definition of third-person consciousness and not merely describe third-person data. And once we have this definition, that's what a scientific study of consciousness should focus on, and not first-person consciousness at all, or even the relationship between first and third-person consciousness. And some of that I'm going to leave to the defense of that I'm going to leave to part 2. So let's get to our third-person definition of consciousness. And I'm going to make 3, I think, relatively uncontroversial assumptions before I get to this definition. The first is that mind, including consciousness, supervenes on the brain. Again, this is not controversial at all within scientists who study the brain. And the second assumption, that the fundamental paradigm in neuroscience and psychology is essentially correct, that the brain is an organ that evolved to process information, performs computation, takes sensory data in, outputs behavior. Again, I don't think that's particularly controversial. The last assumption is that certainly many processes, maybe most, that occur in the brain are unconscious, so we've got two different types of processes. Again, that is certainly not controversial. It's been studied for a long time within psychology. So with those three assumptions, I'm going to get to my definition. And I want to define third-person consciousness as a particular subset of information processing going on in the brain. And I just want to step back for a minute, too, and recognize that, I'm not claiming that too much depends on my particular definition or that it's all that original, rather just to give an example of how we can provide a complete third-person definition. So the obvious question for anyone would be, well, okay, that's great, but what subset of information? And then the answer to that is, well, obviously the subset that leads to conscious experience. So now our definition of third-person consciousness is the particular subset of information processing that leads to experience. Again, I think people would step back and say, well, you're just cheating, you're just smuggling in first-person concepts like experience. So we need to define that experience objectively in this sentence. And I think we can do that. We just have to be a little specific here and operationalize our definition. So we can take, alert language using humans and take their verbal reports at face value when they claim to be having phenomenal experience. So our definition is restricted now to consciousness in alert language using humans, but we would, in those cases, we define consciousness as the particular subset of information processing that leads to reportable experience. And we need to clarify here that, no, we do not mean that third-person consciousness is the information processing that leads to the, output of sentences declaring the subject is undergoing experience. We're actually talking about the information processing that leads to claims by the subject that they would lead to the type of claims to subjects that they were undergoing experience. And people could have this experience even if it was not reported. So that gets a little subtle in that distinction, but I think you can justify this. And I also want to point out this is a preliminary definition, and I think that's one of the key benefits of scientific study of consciousness is to start from the get-go that we don't totally have an understanding of consciousness, and that's part of what we want to understand through neuroscience, psychology, and that all these hypotheses are empirical hypotheses that are open to refinement. Now there's a couple of ways to obviously expand our definition. The first is, given the extensive literature examining behavioral signs of consciousness in animals, we can certainly broaden our definition to include animals or humans without language. And in this case, we would say third-person consciousness in humans and mammals, and we could limit what to certain mammals if we would like. The particular subset of information processing that leads to behaviors associated with experience. And again, we have to clarify here that we're not talking about information processing that's simply leading to the output of behaviors, but the the actual processing in the brain that would lead to behaviors that are ultimately defined or identified with conscious experience. So now, of course, we would ask, well, what's the ultimate definition of third-person consciousness? And the ultimate definition would be able to define third-person consciousness in any system, and it would be very nice to have such a definition, because then we could determine whether animals much farther away from us on the phylogenetic tree, reptiles, amphibians, fish, even lower animals like worms, or of course the question for many of us would be whether machines or uploads would be conscious. And this ultimate definition would be that third-person consciousness is the particular subset of information processing that leads to experience. And in this case, we would have to have a generalizable identifier of experience. And this is something we clearly do not have, but I think that's one of the major goals of the scientific study of consciousness, is that we want such a definition. And once we have that, then we could generalize consciousness to all of these other animals or systems. And of course, if we have these third-person definitions, then consciousness can be studied, using normal methods of science, including examining behavior, verbal reports, studying the physiology of the brain. And of course, this has already been done, and this approach has shown the relevance of concepts like attention, executive functioning, working memory. And this is, of course, the global workspace theories, and these have been refined through the use of third-person science. And now the final point here is getting back to the original topic of this part one, is that I'm defining physical consciousness as exactly as this third-person consciousness, the particular subset of information processing that leads to experience. Now in part two, we're going to get a little bit more into that definition and contrast it with some other concepts. But for part one, I think the conclusions are that scientists need only worry about third-person consciousness. Theories like integrated information theory that mix first and third-person approaches to consciousness are unlikely to advance our scientific understanding of consciousness. And in the discussion, certainly we can talk more about IIT and how that mixes these approaches. And purely first-person approaches like quantum approaches, here I'm thinking, of course, of Penrose and Hameroff, are the least useful approaches to consciousness. So this is the end of part one, and then there's certainly plenty to discuss, and I'm going to get into a lot more philosophy in part two. All right, now we're going to talk about part two of how to construct a well-constrained theory of consciousness. I get into a little more of the philosophy. I think a lot of questions immediately arise from the first talk, such as what about first-person consciousness? How can we ignore this? That's a big part of the debate, and brings up David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, which we're going to get into some of that. And what about the relationship between first and third-person consciousness? So I want to address some of these questions. And I think a lot of the concern is that there's this gap, and of course this has been called the explanatory gap, between first-person consciousness and third-person consciousness. And I want to get into some discussion that I think will show that we can really significantly narrow this gap. But I don't want to get rid of that. I think that's going too far, and I don't think we need to do that for a good scientific theory of consciousness. We can leave a lot of the first-person consciousness to metaphysics and just get on with the scientific study of consciousness by looking at third-person consciousness. So we're going to do a little philosophical interlude. I think actually most of this is going to be a philosophical interlude. So I want to talk about Keith Frankish and his theory of illusionism, which is very similar to Daniel Dennett's theories explained in Consciousness Explained in some of his other work, but I think putting it on a little better philosophical foundation, making it a little clearer. The central premise of illusionism is that our sense that it's like something to undergo conscious experiences is due to the fact that we systematically misrepresent them, or their objects, as having phenomenal properties. And specifically, I want to borrow his concept of quasi-phenomenal property. And this is a non-phenomenal physical property, perhaps a complex one, that introspection typically misrepresents as phenomenal. For example, quasi-phenomenal redness is the physical property that typically triggers introspective representations of phenomenal redness. There's nothing phenomenal about such properties, nothing feely or qualitative. They present no special explanatory problem, and strong illusionists hold that introspective properties of experience are merely quasi-phenomenal ones. So illusionism is essentially an anti-realist theory about both first and third person consciousness, that basically everything is quasi-phenomenal properties that are not either first or third person conscious. And that's a part of the theory that I disagree with. And again, I've already talked about that we don't need to become anti-realists about first person consciousness. That I think is going too far and doesn't really help us in the debate. But I also think it's an extreme position to deny third person consciousness. All the data we have for a century of studies in psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And I think illusionism really loses much of its force when we formulate consciousness in third person terms. And I also now want to talk briefly about the meta problem of consciousness. And again, both of these discussions is to help us narrow this gap. So the meta problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why we think there's a problem of consciousness. And due to supervenience, which of course is, again, not a controversial assumption at all, there's got to be a physical explanation. So the meta problem is a problem about a problem. The initial problem is the hard problem of consciousness. Why and how do physical processes in the brain give rise to conscious experience? The relevant sort of consciousness here is phenomenal. A system is phenomenally conscious if there's something it's like to be in that system from the first person point of view. The meta problem is roughly the problem of explaining why we think phenomenal consciousness poses a hard problem, or in other terms, the problem of explaining why we think consciousness is hard to explain. So let's get back to physical consciousness. Again, I explained that as third-person consciousness, the particular subset of information processing that leads to experience. And you can also look at physical consciousness as very similar to quasi-consciousness as, third-person process going on, but without the anti-realism. You can provide perfectly realistic definitions of third-person consciousness that does not require us denying many of the concepts in psychology. And again, you could give a physical explanation for all first-person experiences, including the meta problem. So I want to talk about some terms here, because I guess it can get a little bit confusing. So we have several first-person terms, which I think are all essentially synonymous: experience, phenomenal experience, qualia, consciousness. And you have the Frankish version of those terms. You just put quasi in front of them: quasi-experience, quasi-qualia, quasi-consciousness. And then you have, what I want to do is third-person terms that don't have the anti-realist assumptions of Frankish, that there's no illusion going on, that third-person experience is a third-person experience. And, I've also term that physical experience. So either one of those would work, and you have third-person qualia or physical qualia. And again, all these, the last two columns of terms are synonymous. So here, where I want to use all that previous discussion to see if we can narrow the gap a little bit. So on the left, we have third-person terms, could be defined as physical or quasi, and the right column here we have the qualia. So let's start with the simple one of just the qualia of seeing red. We have, intuitively, we all have a notion of that from the first person perspective. And from the third person perspective, we could define this experience at whatever level we want at the scientific level, and certainly neural networks firing in the parietal lobe would be a good level, and I think even more useful would be at the level of cognitive neuroscience, where there is a lot of specific information processing going on in the brain, and that since experience is reportable, there also must be a self-model going on that includes modeling of this experience, and we could call that physical red, and if we wanted to be anti-realist, we could call it quasi-red. And then let's go to a slightly more complicated experience, the thought, I am seeing red, sort of self-consciousness. Well, again, at the third-person level, this is at the neuronal level, neural networks in the parietal frontal lobe, maybe firing for a little bit longer, 2,000 milliseconds. We could term this quasi self-consciousness of red, or physical self-consciousness red. And then we take it a little more abstract to the thought of, from the first person perspective, I experience consciousness, I experience red, and it's impossible to see how this could ever arise from neurons. And this is, the hard problem of consciousness and why this is beyond science. From the third person perspective, and again, with the accepting supervenience, there has to be an explanation here in third person terms. So it would be the neural networks in the parietal frontal lobes firing for a little bit longer, or we could look at the information processing level, a much more complicated self model. We could call this quasi meta self-consciousness, or physical meta self-consciousness of red here, if that's what triggered all these thoughts. And so that, here's the explanation for the meta problem in first person terms. Now I think I want to make clear here that this is not explaining away the meta problem, but this is providing a physical explanation of it. And so there's still something left of the meta problem, which we'll get to here. But the point of all that was to narrow the gap where, it's not so easy to separate first-person consciousness from third-person consciousness, because, we can have physical definitions and models of all these concepts, so it becomes a little harder to pick out particularly what is left over for first-person consciousness. And, this is, of course, what Dennett has done a lot of work in the paper Coining Qualia, just looking at what exactly is left over. And, I think that's a totally valid philosophical argument to try to eliminate first-person consciousness, but again, not something that we need to do for a scientific study of consciousness. We can accept that there, is still some small gap there. And, of course, this is a perfect interlude here to the easy, medium, and hard problems and fundamental physics, which is also getting thrown into these discussions. So the problem of explaining third-person consciousness, or what Chalmers calls third-person data, is called the easy problem of consciousness. And the hard problem, we've already kind of quoted a little earlier, is sort of the why. Why is the functioning associated with subjective experience at all? And that is the hard problem. And I built a little pyramid here where you have the hard problem at the top of the pyramid. Why is any physical process generating consciousness or first-person experience? The easy problem of explaining how the brain generates the behavior associated with consciousness. And this has also been recently expanded based on some discussions of integrated information theory, where maybe we need a middle level problem, where what Chalmers and Scott Aronson is described as the pretty hard problem, predicting which physical systems give rise to consciousness, in the middle between the hard and the easy problem. And then physicist Max Tegmark is also getting into this discussion. And he's looking at 4 problems: the easy problem, how does the brain process information? Pretty hard problem, what physical properties distinguish conscious and unconscious systems? Even harder problem, how do physical properties determine qualia? And the really hard problem, which is similar to Chalmers' hard problem. And so what I want to discuss here is that I think we can essentially get rid of these pyramids. We have to get a little bit into metaphysics. And so some of this depends on, there ultimately is no answers to the question of the priority of experience versus perception, other than the circular answer to pick the best argument. And empirical research will not help us at this. So I think that the existence of first-person consciousness is a metaphysical question, and it's a perfectly legitimate metaphysical argument to make arguments like Dennett about, how there is no first-person consciousness. But I think this is separate from what a science of consciousness needs to do. And I think all the pyramids collapse into questions about third-person consciousness, which is a scientific question, and questions about first-person consciousness, which is metaphysics. So, you have the scientific problem and then a metaphysical problem. And again, getting back to the gap problem, you have third-person consciousness is a scientific problem, and whether there's a gap or whether there is first-person consciousness are metaphysical problems. And so here I think you can use some of the things we've discussed to classify all the different theories of consciousness. And my hypothesis, of course, is that theories that give priority to third-person consciousness are really not theories that give priority to first-person consciousness are metaphysical theories, not scientific theories. And you can also look at how theories relate first and third-person consciousness. Again, those are all metaphysical claims. So the scientific theory of consciousness does not need to worry about mental causality, epiphenomenalism, all these kind of things. We can save that for metaphysics. And then there's also the question about realist versus anti-realist positions about first-person consciousness and third-person consciousness as well. Again, often these are metaphysical questions, so things that we don't necessarily have to worry about. So, I'm not going to go through all of these theories, but I think we can classify these theories and look at which are useful scientifically and which are not. So, just a little, and then here I'm just going to get into a little bit of metaphysics. So, we can look at third-person consciousness as part of physics, and if we want to be a physicalist, this is all a reality. And this picture is, I think, what we need to worry about from the scientific perspective. This is going to give us the answers to the questions about generalizing consciousness. We could get into the metaphysics of, well, is this all a reality? And, what is first-person consciousness? And I think those are interesting metaphysical questions, but ultimately not relevant to the science of consciousness. So let's bring all this back to the premise here of the talk, and let's return to Chalmers' paper on how to scientifically study consciousness. So he feels that the primary task of science of consciousness is to link first and third person consciousness. Science of consciousness will not reduce first person data. The third person data will articulate systematic connections. Where there's covariation between the two, we can expect systematic principles to underlie and explain the covariation. So we can expect bridging principles to underline and explain the covariation between third and person data and first person data. A theory of consciousness will ultimately be a theory of these principles. And I'm saying that this is incorrect. A scientific theory of consciousness will have nothing to say about first person consciousness or its relationship to third person consciousness. Bridging principles, if they exist, will need to be defended using metaphysical and not scientific arguments. I think if we can accept this, I think we can hopefully move forward in the scientific study of consciousness and push a lot of these discussions to the side or to philosophy. And here again is Chalmers, that central work in the science of consciousness has always taken first-person data seriously. For example, much central work in psychophysics, perceptual psychology, concerned with first-person data, etc. And here is a central, and this I think is the most subtle point of all this discussion, is that I absolutely agree that any scientific theory of consciousness should look at first-person data, but here we've got to get at our terminology here, and what the last 100 years of science have been doing is looking at third-person, first-person data, what we've talked about as physical experience, or if you want to, quasi-experience. That's what people have been studying. Certainly philosophers and continental phenomenologists may have been looking at first-person experience directly, but that has not what science has been doing, nor is it what science should be doing? So final conclusions here: scientists need only worry about third-person consciousness and questions about first-person consciousness. Sorry, I think I said that wrong. So scientists need only worry about third-person consciousness, questions about first-person consciousness, and the relationship between first and third-person consciousness are metaphysical questions. All right, that's it. Thank you.
So thank you for that absolutely fascinating treatment of a scientific approach to consciousness. We did have a couple of questions. Number one, more generally, how can we make sure that we're having useful conversation about consciousness rather than one that ends up going nowhere or revolving around redefining terminology? That is from Randal.
Well, yeah, I think that is, you know, a key question. And, you know, I think a lot of this, well, I guess what I think is the key is, you know, separating these questions about first and third person consciousness and, you know, recognizing a lot of the, you know, the hard problem and, you know, questions of qualia, et cetera. If we can shift that more to metaphysics, I think we would, you know, help move the scientific study of consciousness forward. And I think it's interesting because you have, you know, major scientific theories of consciousness like integrated information theory that are very different than your typical theory of consciousness. And, you know, the very foundation of theories like that, they incorporate really untestable, you know, philosophical principles. So it's, you know, it's subtle, but I think if you start a theory that way, you're going to have some, you know, major problems. And I think the ultimate mistake would be to do something like, you know, the quantum theories of consciousness, where not only, well, you take a first-person perspective, but you're essentially, you know, ignoring third-person science, so all the neuroscience, everything we know about the brain, and just starting from a, you know, metaphysical, you know, mystery of the first-person consciousness. So I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at is, you know, before we, you know, debate these theories, we need to look at the, you know, the most basic level. What are they coming from, a first-person or third-person perspective?
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering then, you know, give difference between the way that Koch goes about looking at a you know, a scientific approach to consciousness versus, you know, it baffles me a little bit that that someone with as much background and expertise as he's got that he would take that route. So, ever spoken with him personally about this?
I have had a few emails back and forth, and it's funny because the last email I had was about the simulation argument, which is something that you know, Keith and I have been talking about, but it sort of degenerated into the we were talking about uploading, and, you know, I mean, supposedly IIT, the theory shows that you know, an upload or simulation would not be conscious, and it ended with me trying to explain how the analogy with the hurricanes, simulated hurricanes aren't wet, is different. But that's about it. I mean, it hasn't been an extensive debate.
Just to be clear, I think that Koch is not ruling out the possible consciousness of uploads, except in the case of simulations. So I think he and Tanani are on board with the consciousness of you know, sort of electrical, you know, sort of physical brain-like things. The sci-fi examples are sort of, you know, Commander Data's brain. If it's a physical, you know, super parallel computer or something, I think that counts in their book. They don't like simulations.
Well, yeah, and it gets to the funny math of IIT, where they're talking about, you know, to calculate phi, it makes a difference if it's, you know, feed-forward networks and things like that. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that's, and in so many systems they say, well, phi is 0, therefore, you know, it's not going to be conscious, which I don't totally understand. how they would get that for some of these calculations. But that's, yeah, I agree. Like if you had a data with a positronic brain that, has the magical 5 formula, then yeah, a machine or upload will be conscious, according to.
It gets even stranger in that sense, right? I mean, they're not against all simulations. They're only against simulations in a very specific way. So they're against simulations done on a von Neumann style computer. They're not against simulations done on their implementation of a neural net.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't remember where that comes from.
When you hear Tononi speak, for example, why he draws, he kind of draws this line and says, if we're going to calculate, then we have to calculate phi on the transistors, molecules, not atoms, not within the virtual representation of a neural network, but it has to be at the transistor level. A bit arbitrary, and I've never gotten a good answer.
Yeah, have you read Max Tegmark's book, The Life 3.0?
No, I haven't yet.
Because he sort of tries to answer that question by looking at, is there some kind of fundamental level of physics that we can generalize at IIT that we would be able to answer your question? Because I think you make a great point of why is it transistors? Why is it not the computational level? So he attempts to address that. I mean, I don't think he solves it, but it's an interesting discussion.
What does he say?
Well, he, you know that pyramid where it had the 4 levels?
Okay.
He tried to find a, he calls it not computronium, but he comes up with some other term to try to find like actually a literal fundamental law of physics that would explain consciousness, like it fits a specific law, which again I think is kind of going the opposite of like a neuroscience definition of, well, let's figure out what consciousness is, and it's obviously a much higher level process than fundamental physics, but that's kind of what he attempts to do. I mean, I don't think he succeeds, but it's interesting. It's definitely worth.
In your opinion, have any of the other thinkers and writers have any of them gotten past Chalmers' challenge that all they're doing is seeing neural correlates? And I actually think neural correlates of consciousness is valuable. I don't denigrate it, but Chalmers makes this distinction that at best all we're doing is sort of figuring out how the brain's doing it, but we're not solving his hard problem.
Exactly, and I think that's a great point. It's something I was trying to address with the whole third-person consciousness, where we don't, ultimately we're not interested in the neural correlates of consciousness. We want to understand, consciousness as a computational process at the third-person level, where, if we can do that, then we could, specifically look for that in, like I said, other animals or other systems. So I think that gets a lot of neuroscientists hung up because, they're just, the philosophers are telling them, oh, you're only looking for the neural correlates. And, I think we can do a lot better than that.
Can I,
hey, Ken.
Hi, sorry.
I knew you wouldn't like the metaphysics part.
I'm sorry I missed it.
Oh, did you? Okay.
So I just wanted to ask on the Chalmers thing, has he provided any way that could be addressed, or is it kind of he's defining the problem in such a way that there is no way to address it?
The hard problem? I think exactly what you said. I think it's defined
beyond neural correlates of consciousness.
Exactly, yeah. That it seems the way he's defining it is a pretty unsolvable problem. So
I mean, I would think that I mean, of course, this isn't an experiment that you could possibly do, but if somebody uploads and says what it's like being an upload, that should, I would hope that would address Chalmers' issues, but I know it wouldn't.
Well, but
Yeah.
Even a successful experiment would consist of an upload reporting that they had no sensorial or experiential difference. So what would you learn from an upload saying everything feels the same? What would sort of funny experiment? It's exactly what we expect them to say, but what would that actually teach us, even though it's what we expect?
Well, I think there's, I mean, if I was giving an argument against this, it would be that if an experiment like that doesn't convict, then what you're essentially saying is that consciousness is the way that you're defining experiential consciousness is an epiphenomenon in the sense that it doesn't help at all.
I'm sorry, you're addressing a slightly different question.
Okay.
There was the okay. We've got two. No. That's okay. There were two questions on the table. One was, can we understand the hard problem? Can we understand why qualia take on the properties that they do? And the other question was, can we address the challenge that uploads might be the equivalent of philosophical zombies? And I think you addressed the second, the common concern that an upload might not be conscious in an undetectable way because it behaves exactly the same way, and we never have any visibility to the fact that what we've actually done is create a p-zombie. Which is a question that comes up and is worth answering, but it still gets back to, or there still is this, I think, almost unrelated question of, can we ever, and I don't mean to be so challenging on this, can we ever understand why consciousness sort of happens and why it has certain properties, why color experiences aren't taste experiences, and I don't know if we should obsess over that or whether it's just a question we have to sort of let go of. I am personally sort of flummoxed by it. I would like to understand why. And I have to admit, I have a hard time believing that a perfect physical understanding of the brain is going to answer those questions for me. And I admit that, and I'm not quite sure where that leaves me.
Yeah, you can a way where they become unanswerable no matter what you do. But some of the things that you when you're trying to explain what your real question is, for example, why are taste experiences not color experiences or something like that? The interesting thing about that is that you can actually do that. You can remap experiences. Yeah.
And you have synesthesia.
That actually speaks strongly the fact that we should be focusing on information on why experiences are a certain way as expressed through function. Find by looking at information processing that's really what's going on. Anderson thing, it's that why is it this particular way and not that way, rather than that you're not just answering hello I'm conscious because you've been programmed to say hello I'm conscious and you're actually a p-zombie. That's the part that ultimately you have to simply accept someone's word at face value, as Michael said. It's you can never really prove, I can't prove that you are actually conscious or whether you're a p-zombie. The only thing that people would say is, well, we think that you're made up of the same biology and that you were born the same way other people were born, and therefore if I'm conscious, you're conscious. But that's also a pretty weak argument.
Yeah.
But if you had I mean, these are thought experiments, but let's say you scanned a person's brain while they're alive. Simulated it or whatever resolution would be necessary, and made sure that they were synchronized. Again, this is a thought experiment. There's probably arguments that this couldn't work, but if you had the a simulated brain and the biological brain, and the biological person says, I feel that this color red is a little bit more fiery than what I remember it used to be. Okay, and it's trying to get to a qualia type of a statement, and then we look in, and the simulated brain does exactly the same thing. And we look in the simulated brain and we see exactly, and we can look in the biological brain as well, we can see exactly the causal mechanisms that give rise to that utterance. and you know, if at that point, and you can imagine any type of manipulation that you want to give, you know, you squirt a little bit of you activate these neurons, and it says, oh, now it is just what I remember, or now it looks green, you know, and you understand what's going on at the causal symbolic level. If it seems to me like that would be addressing the problem without potentially answering Keith's concern of essentially giving an explanation that we can be satisfied with, to say, oh yeah, that's where qualia comes from.
I would even say that, you know, I mean, this thing that you're talking about, actually explaining why, knowing that red may be seeming a little different than it might otherwise seem, that's really about the information processing. And to me, that is the thing that we need to be talking about. Because in the end, whether you actually get red, the qualia of red exactly right, if you still experience it as exactly the same red that you experienced before, argument for or against consciousness or about the success and upload. Because I would say, you know, we change the way we experience things all the time. If I drink alcohol or something like that, I might experience red differently. Yeah. So
Well,
that's not even a question.
I think, yeah, and I think, Ken, you did a great job of describing what Frankish would call, you know, quasi-qualia. And I think, you know, that is, you know, what we should be after, and that, you know, that's all we're ever going to understand. And, you know, like Dennett has done, you know, when you start to really analyze the concepts like the quasi-qualia, you know, and that is responsible for all the causality. There's no, you know, metaphysical red that causes you to do things. It's all, you know, the computation and the, you know, the term quasi-qualia. So the question is, well, what's left over? I mean, what, you know, like I said, that gap, narrowing that gap more and more, so that what does qualia have that quasi-qualia doesn't have? And I think that's, you know, a really strong argument where I don't have an answer to that, and I think that's pretty hard to, you know, to articulate even what that would, you know, what that would mean.
I'm not sure if this is directly related to that point, but I wonder if in transitioning from third to first person reports or third and first person explanations, if somewhere there in that transition or in that gap is where otherwise very, you know, rational scientists tend to jump and make a leap where they start to favor an account or a theory of consciousness that involves elevating it to a fundamental thing in physics and saying there has to be some fundamental representation of some kind of consciousness. And this is a high level representation, a high level combinations. I wonder what you think about that.
I think that happens all the time. You know, I think both with Tononi, I mean, obviously with, you know, Roger Penrose, I mean, you know, very, very, very smart people. And, you know, once you make that leap, I think you've sort of left, you know, science. I mean, there's no, you know, neuroscience cannot, you know, address those things. All we can do is look at, you know, what is actually going on. What are the causal processes, and, you know, we can call those quasi, but, you know, what is left over.
So I feel like I'm probably gonna get the same answer, but so I remember during one discussion back probably with Randal, I brought up the idea of so you got these this complete access, let's say, hypothetically. You got this biological brain, and you got this this computer simulation that is synced up to it. And now let's say we shut down the biological brain, okay? But the computer simulated brain is still experiencing something, and or it's still running. Let's just say it's still running. So it's still running, it's still doing everything, and then we sync them back up again, including making the changes to synapses or whatever is necessary to encode those memories that were so that they're synced up with the simulated brain. So now what you've got is you've got a biological person remembering qualia. Okay, but it's remembering qualia that essentially were written in on the simulated brain, because it was never experienced in the biological brain. Does that type of, I mean, to me that either says that you know, that should either argue something, or it should mean that any remembrance of qualia cannot be trusted, which is probably true. But
I think that, yeah, I think the latter half is you know, is that true? You know, anything beyond the specious present, you know, is you know, all open.
We don't have access to the specious present either.
Well, yeah.
I mean, so it's a slippery slope to saying that that all that we, so you know, let me try to formulate this into a reductio ad absurdum argument against Chalmers' ideas. Okay, so if memory is all that we have access to in terms of reports, and even self-reports, you know, even our own thinking of what our qualia was like, you know, we don't have instant access to that. Then and if any of those memories could have been just as well be memories of your simulated brain that got written in as memories in the biological, then it almost says that we have as good of access to that in this thought experiment, as good as access to the qualia of that simulated brain as we would our own brain. We could compare the two, and they would have to be identical because we're going off the same memorial representation.
Well, that's a good point. I guess another point that Michael was alluding to is that all qualia is remembered qualia. It might be fractions of a second, but it's actually sort of all the same story. When you think about qualia, you're thinking about some experience you had in the past, whether it was a minute ago or a year ago. And then, you know, extensions of the experiment you're proposing, which I think are actually more accessible to current neuroscience, aside from creating full uploads and sort of translating their experiences back over. Fill me in, Ken and Randall and Michael. Aren't we already running some early experiments in implanting fake memories and things like this? And you know, what is implanting a fake memory if not essentially doing precisely this, basically creating you know, sort of illusory qualia memories that don't mirror any real experience? I'm not quite sure where that goes. It goes, first of all, it goes to the fact that qualia don't have to come from senses. It really is just sort of written in somewhere in the way memories are stored.
I know that there's a heck of a lot of papers that say that we're encoding false memories, but the most well known is the Tonegawa type of experiments where you're optogenetically activating those neurons that make the mouse think that it's in another cage.
Oh my.
And so if I was, I mean, it would be really fascinating to be able to do these in humans, because the real question is, does the mouse think that it's in the other cage, even though it's in cage B? It thinks it's in cage A, in which case it's not really a false memory that you're writing a false experience.
You're fooling it. You're fooling it, which happens all the time, and you don't call that a...
Yeah, so Randal, is there an example that wouldn't fall into that category, where you're actually writing a memory that has never been experienced?
I'm not sure about never experiencing, but I certainly do know that even in very, it seems like it's not directly related to this, but take the hippocampal prosthesis project, where the experiment involves generating a pattern that supports either one recollection or another, and therefore helps get the right recollection to happen and then respond correctly. This is what the mice and the monkeys and then the human patients have to do. The stimulation that's being provided is causing them to recall one thing or another, or helping them recall one thing or another. And you would say this is something completely external, has very little to do with the actual environment or what's happening in front of them. So I think it's similar. Yeah.
So it would be very interesting to, for me, I would be very fascinated in seeing if there is some kind of neuroscience experiment that would actually, address these things from Chalmers' point of view.
Yeah, I really wish that there were a program of study where we are gradually doing exactly what you and Michael are both saying, which is you have to kind of take apart all of the things about qualia that we can explain. We try to explain those, and then what's left, what's still there that isn't explained, what's left for the first person. This comes back to an argument that you made a long time ago, Ken, where you basically said who we are is really all of these memories, and the part that we're experiencing in this moment, whether I'm happy, whether I'm sad, this is something that's very much the same across people. It's actually the part that's very similar, that just makes us human. It's not the part that makes me, me, or makes Keith, Keith, or makes you, Ken. That's the memories. And just now, you also mentioned, or I think, I'm not even sure, was it Michael, was it Keith? One of us mentioned that even the experiences you're having at the moment have already been filtered through a process of memory of some kind, even if it's conceptual memory, a very temporary memory. So you can be from this interaction with memory and the momentary thing being much more basic and simple, at least from how is this process carried out. And that, to me, is opposition to the approach that people who are coming more from the Chalmers side are taking, where they seem to assume that consciousness is an enormously complex thing that is perhaps to explain much more fundamental, much more physically or something than say memory. That memory is just a bunch of ones and zeros. And I don't want to criticize too heavily any of recently been doing this on this Michael Johnson or Mike Johnson be listening to this, who has done some nice work writing up some theories about qualia and how they may arise through harmonious versus disharmonious processes and things like that. And I think that's great. This emphasis on trying to describe qualia and consciousness as being a somewhat separate thing from memory, that I think you can't get there without memory. So yeah, that's the main point I wanted to make. I really think take it all down. If we keep on explaining how does this work, how does that work, how does that work, at some point you've explained so much that the old way to talk about consciousness and say really vague, make big claims about it, that kind of drops away, just like the whole discussion about the élan vital. At some point that just becomes kind of quaint and old-fashioned because you've got all these other, at least that's what I hope.
I have another question. This topic of qualia in their interactions with memory. My understanding is that short-term and long-term memory are thought to be encoded very differently. One is sort of these sort of rapid on-the-fly chemical changes that can be made quickly but don't have a lot of survivability. And in fact, that's why short-term memory is sort of difficult to retain in situations of losing consciousness temporarily as perhaps all those short-term chemical circuits get wiped out. And then long-term memory is encoded in a completely different way, which is through the actual formation of long-aged synapses, and it's basically a totally, completely different way to encode ultimately a very similar sort of representation of the experience. I assume someone will jump in and interrupt me if that intro is wrong, but on that basis, the question is, it's profoundly incredible that something as bizarre as qualia can be encoded in two very, very different ways, if there's anything fundamentally physical about what's going on. Alternatively, if what qualia and experience is some sort of informational construct, then that could be represented in, and here it comes, substrate independent ways, almost. You could say that the way that the short-term biological memory and the long-term sort of synaptic memory are encoding these things, we might actually be able to discover an information theoretic similarity between similar memories as they're translated from short to long term, which would give some sort of fundamental insight into how memories and qualia can be represented in informational ways that abstracts them from the, just from the physical stuff. This short-term memory is stored in a chemical way, this long-term memory is stored in a synaptic way, but we have no idea why. Maybe the existence of both is the key to finding, sort of the information that ties together the ideas of certain kinds of memories. And then, of course, that obviously leads over to, well, if you can store them these ways, that gives us, an obvious floodgate into representing things in now artificial systems.
I think you're right that it's important to find and to discuss where short-term and long-term are similar, where the same type of memory has a similarity that you can describe, and that, of course, is in the activation of the neurons. So if we say there's a neural ensemble that activates whenever I see a car, or if there's a neural ensemble that activates when I see a Porsche, and of course the Porsche neural ensemble may have some similarities with a neural ensemble for, I don't know, a Volkswagen or something like that. That's really where it is, right? Because short-term memory, even though it uses a different process for retaining this association between the neurons that activate in that neural ensemble, will still reactivate that neural ensemble, just like the long-term memory will. It's just a different way of storing the association between those neurons. It's not a different ensemble, not necessarily. And now I'm glossing over a bunch of stuff about things get, marked first in places like the hippocampus and eventually can be retrieved without the hippocampus and all that. But that doesn't really matter here. It's really just that we have to say, okay, even if we're talking about short-term versus long-term physiological methods of encoding an association between neurons, it's still the neural ensemble that counts when we're talking about what we're actually experiencing. The activity of the neurons is what counts. So that's where your similarity is.
And that must be what was being discovered in these hippocampal experiments when they were. I'm actually not thinking of Berger. I'm thinking of the other presenter, Zhang, who had actually sort of read out these temporal encodings of memories, and I was asking him at the time, whether he could sort of put any, sort of fundamental or underlying insight into what sort of encodings represent certain kinds of memories and things like that.
Yeah, he's definitely working on decoding between memories in certain ways to find out, can we categorize, or these types of activities are about objects and these kinds of activities are something else like temperature or something like that. Yeah, he's those kinds of statistical correlations between different types of ensemble activities. Yeah.
So I want to say one thing. So I've said this before, but I really think that there is one key thing that that neuroscientists that that jump the shark, if you will, on the consciousness question. They make one assumption that is unfounded, and I think this is Dennett's whole point. Okay, Dennett's whole point is that you cannot say that a particular representation in the brain at a particular time is being that the person is conscious of it at that particular moment. So and the reason why I bring this up is because we're dancing now between neuronal ensembles and memorial associations of neuronal ensembles that could be brought back. And it's very easy to therefore say, well, when a particular neuronal ensemble is active, you are conscious of a particular thing. And I'm glad you're disagreeing with that, Randall. But I think that is what a lot of people assume, for good reason, because it's very related to it. But just the activation of those neurons, and even they're interacting with the system at a particular time, that there can't be a one-to-one correspondence between that and consciousness. But that is the thing that everybody is looking for. And so if you're saying, well, what could that possibly be? You've got this activation of neurons, and it's going to cause all these downstream processes, but we don't care about the downstream processes. We don't care about the behavior and the memory and the downstream effects on decision-making processes. We want to know why these neurons firing gives us the feeling of red. And what Dennett says is, no, you don't have any privileged reason to say that there is a feeling of red at that moment. The only reason why you have an idea that there is a feeling of red is because of the downstream processes. And therefore, you should think of consciousness not as a thing that happens right now in the Cartesian theater. You should think of consciousness as a process, as a information process that is going on. And at that point, if you make that shift from consciousness now in the Cartesian theater, why is there a link between this firing of neurons and this qualia? If you make the transition to saying there is a process that seems to have qualia because it's written in memory and it's behaving like it is, and et cetera, then the hard problem disappears. It just disappears. And that's my take on it, at least.
I change that because it's a pet peeve of mine is that people talk about consciousness or conscious experience as something that is momentary, that is in a state of one, like some sort of momentary state rather than a process. And I find it weird that we do this because we don't emphasize or fixate on that when we talk about other ings, right? We say experiencing, and instead of talking about a process, we talk about this state. But when we say calculating, we don't make that big fuss. If you say you're calculating, it's a certain set of processes that are going on. And as you work your way through the processes and the interactions between them and how this influences that, that's calculating. Experiencing is similar in that way.
So could it be that so Mike, is this something that the philosophers are just a majority of them are not getting, or they're not agreeing with? Is there a philosopher? Let me ask it slightly different. Can you think of a philosopher that accepts the idea that consciousness is a process and not a qualia is occurring at this moment t in time, that nonetheless thinks there's a hard problem?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think you made a great point about looking at it as a process. And I think when you're talking about that, I just thought of exactly of IIT, where they're trying to find a magic information formula that captures that moment rather than the process. Or, you know, even the latest extreme would be the physicist Max Tegmark looking at, like, you know, a fundamental law of physics somewhere that causes that moment of qualia. So I think you made a good.
It's not my point; it's Dennett's point. But
I think, well, I think that's an excellent point. Well, I mean, I guess, I mean, I still have some sympathy for. I don't know if you caught the last part of the talk, but the some of these metaphysical questions. I mean, I have some sympathy for them, but kind of my point was that they're not science. You know, this is. You know, I completely agree that you know, we need to separate these questions. But you know, I think it's all mixed together right now, and I think that's part of the confusion, because you're not going to get anywhere with a, you know, philosopher that is coming from you know, the standpoint of we have to find a first-person scientific view of consciousness versus, you know, someone that's coming in from a, like Daniel Dennett, you know, the heterophenomenology. I think you're you know, they're just never gonna communicate.
Before we just go on with more questions, even though it's great that we're heading there, I just wanted for a moment to actually thank you for that keynote, Michael, because we never really had this sort of separation between that and the panel discussion. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for putting that together.
I think there's a so as we're kind of transitioning from consciousness and how people talk about consciousness to sort of related problems that come up. One that I wanted to mention, because Mike Johnson, who had the qualia paper, as well as several in this, and it basically comes down to the problem. So basically the same kind David Brin sometimes mentions, and that even Ed Boyden sometimes comes up with, that the problem here is, even if we're looking at just the third, if we're talking about processes in the brain, where do you go and where do we stand on that? Because the from neuroscientists is we do not know which level we should be talking about, and so therefore we have to assume that it goes as potentially all the way down to whatever, and that's eventually when you end up at, right? So everything's open. But how do we even discuss what is the correct scale? Is there a systematic attempt to scale at which you could talk about an emulation of a brain or load? And I'm just bringing this up because it happens to time. But of course, the actual moderator, which I think is Jesse, take over with where the questions are concerned. So anyone, open table.
So you were sort of opening the question of how we would determine at what level of, say, precision of emulation of a brain we've captured the relevant level, and everything below that's sort of plumbing. Was that your question?
Yes, yes, indeed.
So Randal, there's a little bit of at least as I see it, a little bit of a problem with the microphone.
I think you're muted, actually.
Can anyone hear?
Oh, yeah, I think you were muted for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so did you hear any of what I was saying before?
Part of it.
Yeah, you were coming in and out. 90%, 90%, or at least I heard 90%.
All right. Okay, well, you probably know the question, which is the scale separation problem. And, you know, if you don't have a way to approach that problem, then you eventually always have telling you that, you know, we have no idea which level and potentially this goes all the way down again to the quantum level.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Well, that's come up. And then just to give a quick example of the other extreme would be a sort of a behaviorism approach of just black boxing the entire brain away to, you sort of don't worry about any internals if the seeming input-output function has been reproduced. If the behavior of the system is the same, then you call that, sort of a proper emulation. That would be sort of the other end of the spectrum, where preserving quarks at the other end, and the truth is somewhere in between. And I agree. I'm not sure I've heard an answer that's going to convince is there any one position on that spectrum that would convince more than 50% of the population, or is there no winning place?
Well, I mean, I would suggest that at least there is a assumption that neuroscientists use, and that is the activity of neurons. So if I stick an electrode into a particular nerve cell, I can relate that to a whole bunch of qualia. And if I, at least in mice, or in humans in certain cases, like the hippocampal stuff that Randal was talking about, or in stimulation of the visual cortex or stimulation of other areas, that you're activating neurons gives the same result. If you activate these neurons, it feels like somebody is touching your hand.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that probably says something, right?
Okay, so yes, but of course we're oversimplifying neurons at this point, because it's not that neurons are they're not firing until the memory's there and then the memories are firing. Rather, they have sort of firing rates which sort of increase and decrease. So then if we wanted to compare a model, say an emulation, to let's say we could run ideal experiments, and we have the biological brain on one side, the emulation, and we're trying to make comparisons, then it'll never be the question of, is the emulation perfectly mirroring in its firing behavior down to the last action potential that of the biological brain? The question will be, are there sort of broad statistical behavioral patterns present, at a sufficient level of sort of replicable precision or something? And then we're still back in the question of, okay, well then what is our threshold? If the sort of information overlap is kind of 99%, we say okay, that is captured memory, but 95% we say not good enough. And it's also possible it's not a hard threshold. Maybe all of this really is some sort of smooth kind of spectrum of good enoughness, and you can't draw a line.
Well, I mean, I guess this gets into the replacement problem. And so, somebody that would do a Chinese room argument, right, would the whole idea behind the Chinese room argument, to me at least, is it's kind of a bait and switch. It's like you've replaced everything that will give you the same output, but everything on the inside is totally different. And so we can't possibly believe that that's going to be give you the same internal feeling of what it was like. And I mean, my argument, I don't know if this is, it's not principled maybe, but it would have to tie back to are the memorial representations of self still captured? So, I mean, at the very least, you should be able to replace each and every neuron with an artificial neuron. That says something about the level. If you replaced an ion channel with another ion channel, it wouldn't make a difference. If you replaced a neuron with an artificial neuron, it wouldn't make a difference. How can I say that it wouldn't make a difference? Because the models that we produce in neuroscience, which is as close as we can get to the truth at this point, right? Those models suggest that if you replace a neuron with an artificial neuron, it's not going to make a difference. They don't suggest that if you replace an ion channel with that everything is going to change. I think that there's a seeming slippery slope to that Searle would say that goes all the way to the Chinese room argument, and I guess what I'm saying is there isn't a slippery slope. As long as you're keeping the process that is representing what it is like to be you, which is a set of very particular neuronal processes and representations and memories, as long as you're keeping those the same, then you can replace anything. And so the level of representation would be the level of representation that we have conscious access to, and that level of representation is the memorial representations that we have access to via ensembles of neurons firing.
Yeah, great point about. Oh, sorry. Just a sec. I just wanted to say quickly that you're opening up this other door now. The scale separation of what details do we need to include from physiology, the sort of the scope. Like I just got a Martin OD about, do we have to, what about taking out pieces that we don't, maybe the enteric nervous system or something like that. Similarly, what if you said memory is very important for this, but the grade is maintained, how important is that? Like say if you're slightly demented, as in you have slight dementia, you just don't remember everything, you can't remember everyone's name or remember vaguely what something looked like, is that still good enough? So you're,
of course, that's true with a lot of us,
about what is success, what is a successful emulation, right? And where do you draw the line? So I'll let you get right in there, your opinion, to get down to something where we can define that process of of explaining necessary to represent the processes going on in the brain, and then at the same time means in terms of the sort of thing that's required and what people get out of that, and perhaps even seeing what happens in patients who have and that sort of thing. I doubt that we can define this up front.
Well, but is that what Mike was getting at with the delineation between the subjective objective, the first-person consciousness versus third-person consciousness?
Well, I think Ken made a good point about looking at talking about the looking for a functional difference in the brain, and I think that's what. Do you remember like the dancing qualia argument, Ken?
Yeah.
So I think you're looking at. So you would say that. You replace the neurons with a chip, and there's no functional difference. And so, if you have a theory like IIT that would come in and say, or some other theory would say, oh, you destroy consciousness when you do that. That's kind of what I meant about third person and first person consciousness. I think if you make that kind of statement, there's no way that's a scientific statement. That's a metaphysical claim, and it's not testable. I mean, the functional. You upload a person, they're going to say, I feel the same, this is me, and so, how do you ever test that? And I think that's why these are, and that's kind of what somewhat I was getting on the talk of, these have to be metaphysical claims, because how are we going to test them? And I mean, I guess I have a little sympathy for that, because these are always interesting questions, but there's no point in coming up with a scientific theory about it.
Well, okay. I mean, can I back up to a meta question?
Okay.
So why would people believe that there is a hard problem? Why would people believe that there is a level beyond? Because we're talking about these levels, but this is tied together with the overall discussion. Basically what I'm saying is, hey, there's a certain level that neuroscience tends to work at that says what the causal role is of the macroscopic behavior of the nervous system, and that's kind of like the obvious level that we should be shooting for. And if it turns out that there's a level below that comes in, then neuroscience will find it. But the assumption is that even if we get to that causal level, that there might be some other level that is deeper that you need for the qualia. And so what I'm asking is, why would somebody believe that in the first place?
Because it's a vivid aspect of our experience. Someone's always going to ask about the further fact. It doesn't matter how well you explain pain, you can explain it in evolutionary terms, and they're still going to want to know why it's painful, even if it motivates you to pull your hand out of the fire, but why does it hurt? Like, absolutely. The question will never go away.
Okay, but I want to address that question because that's the interesting question.
Well, so that's kind of like, or go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that the question of why it hurts, why it actually feels like something. There are answers to that. Well, I'm claiming that there are answers to that from a self-modeling point of view. That a self-modeling system that evolved to survive would model pain, itself being in pain, and it would have to have those things that we call qualia in order to survive, and so that's a potential explanation out there, but that is the cognitive science explanation of this, and that is being rejected by as a real explanation. And I guess maybe the question is, why is that being rejected?
Well,
why does that not have the special salt that is necessary to give the spice of quality?
Well, and I think what you get at is kind of what Chalmers has called like the meta problem. Like, why do we think that consciousness has this special ability that can't be explained? And what's interesting is I think Chalmers even acknowledges that, yes, that has to have a physical explanation. That there is, a self-model going on in the brain and these kind of loops that give you that. But he still wants to argue that, that there's still, even though there's a physical cause, there's still something different about that. And that, I think that's what gets really, really interesting about Frankish and illusionism. And like I said, I think it narrows that gap, but I also, agree with Keith. I think some of these are questions in epistemology where, at the end of the day, we filter everything through a conscious experience. All science is filtered through that perspective. So, what is the ultimate authority? Is it experience or is it perception?
So my guess, though, okay, so I'm treat this as a help me psychologically understand this, okay? So if I had to bet, I would say that 1,000 years from now, the best explanation that we would have of qualia is going to be the explanation that we already essentially have. Yes, it'll be much more detailed, and there'll be lots of information, theoretic things that are that really get down to why red is atomic and purple is not, and all these other things, right? But at the core, it's going to be, in 1,000 years in your metaphysics class, you're going to be, this is why pain feels painful. And it's going to be talking about a self model and representations and all of that. And that's going to, and it's going to be a computational explanation. And then there will be a course on how that computational level is implemented at the neural level and eventually got implemented at the transistor level and optical computing level, whatever they have at that point.
Well, I agree, but it's fine. I'm agreeing with that in that it is my expectation that I don't want to phrase it cynically, but it is my expectation that we're not going to sort of find the elusive answer that we're looking for. But I thought I was in the minority on that. I thought that it was sort of your theory, Ken, that once we pull the brain apart enough, we're going to find something that goes beyond neural correlates. To say it all over again, that we'll go beyond merely mapping this neural ensemble to red, or Randall made the point that might be a little bit over precise, but to say that I thought I'd heard you say in the past that you actually have a stronger expectation than I do about the outcome of eventual neuroscience, that you expect to find more at the bottom. And I'm admitting I'm a little sort of hands thrown up in the air. I think there's a place where sort of science butts up against metaphysics, and I'm not sure we're going to get past it.
So what I'm saying is I think that in 1,000 years, not only will that still be the explanation, but those people in 1,000 years will accept that explanation, and they will not understand why people didn't accept that explanation. It's almost like at some point we could be stuck with saying, how can the world be round, because people would be falling off the world, and we could just be like not getting it. And then at some level people just, there's so much evidence, so much builds up so much that it just
gels differently.
I think you've got a point. I think a lot of this has to do with how basically unknown the whole field of really theoretical computational neuroscience is to most people. Most people at this level never think about that. So when they encounter questions like feel like pain, they're not thinking about it and exactly how to start thinking in terms of processes. If to them it feels, but if you really talk them through it, if they've had an experience of if they've had an experience of looking at models and understanding what's going on, it changes. Like, for example, if I just take that question and say, let's be more specific about this question, and feel like pain, what is it I actually feel if I'm just pinching my finger with going on there? And I start thinking in terms of signals and systems and then I can say, okay, hey, this seems like a lot like a car alarm, really. It seems like something that is trying to alert me and trying to tell me to pay attention to that and saying, no, don't ignore me. Look over here. Something's going on over here. And it's a signal that's doing that. And that is why pain feels like pain, because it's something that overrides other things. It takes priority. It tries to attract my attention there. So it's all about interactions, causation. What am I more likely to start attending to? How strong is this motivational stimulus here? And yeah, it still sounds abstract. It still feels a little bit out of there, but you're slowly getting to a better explanation of what the question originally was. When people say, why does pain feel like pain? You're trying to explain more what that question is. And as you explain the question more, the answers start to make more sense.
Yeah, but you have to unpack what I means. So if it's like, this is a signal that grabs my attention, that somebody's going to say, well, that just begs the question. But if you say, what I am is this loop of self-representation, and this loop of self-representation is walking along doing just fine, representing that everything is fine, and then all of a sudden, you stub your toe, And that loop of self-representation just feeds back over and over again about how it needs to stop the problem in its toe, you know, and get out of this situation. And can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this to get out of this? You know, you start, if you can identify with that loop of self-representation, then you kind of see that this is an explanation for the thing that really people want explanation for, the awfulness of pain.
Yep.
I think we're great, but I still need help from Keith on this because I'm not getting something, right?
Well,
because I'm saying that this is, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say, although I'm probably wrong with this is probably a lie. This is a lie. I'm going to lie anyway, though. I'm completely satisfied with this explanation.
Well, you said something that I liked. You said that maybe the answer to my question is that with essentially the same information available, there will be some sort of reshaping of how we conceive of the whole thing, so that it all just sort of falls into place. Because you're right that you know, ancient you know, sort of navigators and astronomers, to a significant extent, actually had a lot of the information that we have in contemporary times, and yet certain aspects of how we sort of view the world are just sort of held differently in ways that sort of click better. I can't come up with an excellent answer. It's not, the roundness of the Earth is not a good example, because the Greeks who knew that the Earth was round actually did get it. So that's not the right example. I can't put my finger on it. But there are examples where, with essentially the same information, there's some sort of modern reshaping of how to look at it, and it all just kind of falls into place. And I actually like, that's one of the best answers I've ever heard to the question I keep throwing at you, is that maybe the seemingly kind of the innocently naive and sort of justifiably naive question of why the heck qualia is like this will just be seen as sort of a whimsically innocent question in 1,000 years, and for a reason that is very hard to predict looking forward. But looking back, it will just it may just make a certain kind of sense, not necessarily because they have a significantly greater or deeper understanding of how the neurons are configured, because I don't think the answer is there in the first place. So that I don't think evolving neuroscience is really going to solve this. It's more like the whole sort of approach to the scientific approach, the scientific view of physical reality will just kind of be in a different place. And it, I can accept that. I also accept that, you know, to propose that as the answer probably comes across as unconvincing to many other people. You know, I'm not sure I'm convincing myself, but I sort of liked hearing you say it.
Okay. I mean, this is why I think I was posing the question a little bit differently, as you know, if people self-reflect and say why they reject this as an explanation, that might be more telling. Maybe a good analogy is the life, like for instance, you know, I'm sure that so I'm not wrong. I'm not right with the roundness of the Earth. Okay, but the idea that life is just chemistry. Yeah, that if you ask the question, why did 200 years ago people just would not accept that, let's say, in a visceral way. Even the people that accepted it probably were like me and say, well, I accept it, but I'm not really comfortable with it. The reason why they would is because they couldn't comprehend the complexity of the chemistry.
Well, okay, so then that did actually come from advancing physical science. So 20th century microscopes basically let us just sort of understand matter and microbiology in a way which just essentially illuminated away the question. But then, okay, so that does go back to your claim, and that's basically the claim that 22nd century neuroscience is just going to see something in there that we're not seeing, and the whole problem sort of falls away from the clarity of that sort of improved understanding of brain function.
Is that we're going to deal with billion neuron systems every other day.
Yeah.
And it just and we're going to have more and more ability to manipulate living human brains and to cause different states of experience, different qualia, different writing in different memories, and you're not going to get a different answer than what you have today, but people are going so I guess what I'm saying is the root of the problem that the explanation of, well, you get 100 billion neurons finely tuned interacting to give an intelligent system that has a self-modeling behavior, and people look at that and they say, they imagine like 100 neurons that are kind of like a thermostat, right? Or some symbolic thing that they write in 100 lines of C code, and they say, no, that can't be it. But so the problem is not one that's a bad explanation. The problem is one that people are not willing to accept the sheer complexity of the brain. And I can guarantee that is what the Chinese room argument is trading on, right? It's the idea that that you can't believe that this person shuttling around little symbols is going to be conscious, and they're throwing out an analogy that basically draws people into assuming that this is a simpler explanation than it is. It's exactly equivalent to saying life can't just be chemistry, because I'm holding 2 test tubes right now, and if I dump this test tube into this test tube, maybe there's going to be a little fizzing, but I'm not going to get some bird flying out.
Yeah.
Right? It's the same thing.
No, I agree. You're putting forward a good proposal.
Well, it's interesting, 'cause I mean, I agree with you, Ken. Like in 1,000 years, we're going to have. We'll look back and a lot of this will make a lot more sense. But I wonder, part of that is going to be our metaphysics too. Our science will change, but maybe our metaphysics will evolve. So we'll look at this, differently. Because I think you described, pain. I mean, I think, Chalmers would say, well, that is a perfect explanation of quasi-pain. There's still something left out. And that's the big question. What are we leaving out? And that's hard to put any kind of, that's the challenging question. But, I think that might evolve together, our sort of metaphysics and our, scientific understanding of the brain. And I guess, what Chalmers or someone would say would be, you're always going to have 2 perspectives. You're always going to have the first person and the third person perspective. And, ultimately, it is a question of, I think, epistemology. I mean, how much force do you give your own experience versus your perception, which of course, perception being, science and all the other things. So I think that question is still going to be there, but maybe our metaphysics will evolve in such a way that, something like monism, like we'd be able to see things, it would make more sense, but partly because we have a different metaphysics about things. Or maybe it's physicalism. I mean, even if that's part of it, I still think that's also, evolving of our metaphysical understanding of the universe.
That's an interesting question, Mike. Do you think that, this is probably a big question within philosophy departments all over the place, I probably don't have the authority to ask it. Do you think that metaphysical philosophy is making forward progress? Like in the last 20 or 30 years, people have asked a lot of new questions about consciousness. Or, well, I guess, I don't know if they have. People have talked about consciousness a lot, Chalmers, definitely sort of changed the nature of the discussion, and Dennett put out a book and that was, sort of became a huge part of the discussion. Do you think that, in terms of philosophical progress, if that happens?
Well, that's a huge debate. Is there such a thing as, philosophical progress? Has metaphysics ever solved anything? And if you kind of look at the track record, it seems like the answer would be no. So it's interesting. But yet I think there's a much more sophisticated defense of metaphysics than that. But if, you look at it historically, it seems that either things evolve and become science and we figure them out, or they stay metaphysics and nothing ever happens. So I don't know if it's got the best historical record, but
I'm not arguing against it. Since I engage in it a lot myself, I'm in favor of thinking that it's
well, I have too, but it's hard to articulate it.
Yeah.
Can I ask a different question?
Yes.
Because I'm, clearly, there are a lot of people that believe that there is something more than the computational level. I'll say the computational level, and I know everybody in this group understands what I mean by computational level. There are a lot of people that reject mind uploading. They reject it in principle, based upon the idea that it isn't just the computational level. I think that's how I would interpret it. So I guess what I'm asking is, if somebody rejects the possibility of mind uploading, or if somebody rejects the possibility of mind or brain simulation of any type that involve qualia, et cetera, or seek a much deeper level than the computational level that neuroscience is playing at, and all the experiments point to, then should we look at them as essentially we would look at somebody that's in biology and rejecting evolution, and first of all ask, oh, you're rejecting evolution. That's wonderful. That's fantastic. Why are you rejecting evolution, and what is the evidence that is causing you to doubt, what's in the textbooks?
I would say from a scientific standpoint,
an answer to that. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say absolutely. We should just from a scientific standpoint, like someone like Hameroff wants to throw in the quantum, microtubules. I think we should absolutely reject that, just like we would reject someone with evolution. But if someone wants to make a metaphysical comment on consciousness, I don't know that we should really be that concerned either way.
So I guess what I'm saying is it seems like, when I'm out there saying that that neuroscience today implies that mind uploading is possible, to the extent that neuroscience might be drastically wrong, then that implication might be drastically wrong. But neuroscience today implies that strongly. So if somebody comes along and says that neuroscience says nothing toward that, or that they think that this is impossible, should that is that making it seems to me like that's making a very strong claim, and people should understand that they're making a strong, potentially outlandish claim when they're saying that that there is a deeper level that qualia exists at, or
I absolutely agree. And so someone would say, you say, okay, I upload your brain, and we've got all the sciences telling us everything, and let's say you have a skeptic, and so I would say, well, you agree with me that this upload is capturing all this third-person consciousness, and let's assume you convince them, that, well, okay, I guess so. And then I would say, so you're making the further metaphysical claim that an upload, even though it has third-person consciousness, doesn't have first-person consciousness. And so how do you defend that with your metaphysics? And then I think they would be forced into a corner of saying, well, gee, you know, maybe it's some kind of, you know, biological chauvinism, you know, like Searle sometimes gets into. And so I think you could argue, I think you could convince people that way that, okay, you know, you're not a physicalist, okay, that's fine, but what is your relationship between first and third person consciousness? And I think a lot of, you know, philosophers would have positions that, you know, they're always going to go together. So, you know, it'd be really hard to argue against an upload not having first person consciousness. I think you would have to make a kind of bizarre metaphysical argument. So, I mean, that's kind of, I guess that's how I would try to argue with someone.
I mean, I'm just, it's like, if a biologist were to essentially start doubting publicly that a process of mutation and natural selection gave rise to the complexity of the life forms that we see today. If they said, yeah, you know, if they started really hedge their bets and say, well, I don't believe in this whole evolution thing, they would be ostracized, right? and it seems to me like that is exactly, it should be exactly the same thing for a neuroscientist that is calling into question these types of things. It's like, yeah, yes, I'm not doubting that there's genes, and I'm not doubting that there's natural selection, but there's got to be something more that explains how all the species on this planet came to be. You know, that wouldn't fly. That wouldn't fly. Okay, that's probably what you would get at the Catholic Church or something. They'd be like, yes, there's evolution, yes, there's genes, but you know, God was in there doing something, right? Okay, and I'm hearing the same thing out of neuroscientists, and yet there is no blowback. In fact, there's blowback in the opposite direction, and nobody's calling to question the this assumption. It seems unfair, if you will.
No, I totally, I do see your point, definitely. Well, and it's also because, you know, I mean, to doubt evolution is to doubt, you know, I mean, you know, third person science, and, you know, okay, well then tell me your theory, you know, give me a better theory. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're just, there's still that tricky, you know, metaphysics with consciousness that we haven't figured out yet.
Because for example, I won't name the neuroscientist, but I've you know, I've gotten neuroscientists that say, you know, yes, we understand this part of the nervous system, how, you know, vision works and how this, but we have no idea how consciousness works, right? And it seems like that would be equivalent. That would be equivalent to saying, yes, we understand that genes make proteins, and yes, we understand that there's mutations, but we have no idea how you know, you know, how us and a chimpanzee could have evolved from a common ancestor. We have no idea. No idea. We can't start saying that we evolved from a common ancestor with you know, that we and a chimpanzee evolved from a common ancestor, because we have no idea how that would happen. You know, we don't know what genes were involved. We don't even know if it was genes. You know, that's, you know, so, you can start saying stuff like that, and somebody would be kicked out of biology if they started saying that, right? And yet that's exactly what's being said here. It's saying, you know, yes, we understand how the hippocampus stores this little memory in a mouse, and yes, we understand this, and we understand that we're, you know, there's a lot of complexity in our system, but we can't say that that's where consciousness comes from, right?
Well, so
until we understand every little detail.
So this is your anecdote. Clarify. what percentage of neuroscientists are you saying present this perspective?
I'm going to go with the good old 50%.
No. That's a lot. That's a lot.
I don't have a good theory because I don't have a good estimate here. But yeah, a lot.
So you think that those same neuroscientists, I realize I'm the one who actually presented this, and I'm sort of, my concern that taking the brain apart with sort of the next century technologies, I'm concerned about what answers that may or may not bring, and I understand I'm part of that problem. But are you saying that the professional neuroscientists are a little bit closer to sort of are they a little bit more concerned the way I am than the way you aren't? That they also believe that as their field evolves over the next 100 years, that it's all hopeless to solve this?
I guess what I'm saying is that I mean, first of all, there's a lot of neuroscientists that are very straight-laced and just say, this whole consciousness stuff is just another level of complexity over the stuff that we're seeing right now, and whether the human race will ever figure it out is another thing, but there's no magic in there. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of neuroscientists who'll say that there's no magic in there, and then there's a whole bunch of neuroscientists that will say there's no magic in there, and it's also that the explanation, probably the most likely case is that it exists at the level of explanation that we're looking at. Just like I want to stick with the analogy, because it's like, there's plenty of neuroscientists that could say, and that would say properly, we don't understand all the details. But that same explanation does not work socially when somebody says we don't understand all the details of how evolution by natural selection changed a common ancestor to a human being, and therefore we don't accept that it's just mutation and natural selection. Somehow that is not accepted. Maybe that should be accepted. Maybe that should be accepted. I mean, first of all, there is a connection between these two, because if there is qualia and consciousness and some kind of magic going on, then I don't see how that was found by a process of natural selection. But forgetting that obvious, connection between the two, there are certain things that are socially unacceptable, given the amount of evidence, to raise doubts about evolution, and at the same time they are socially acceptable and applauded when famous neuroscientists like Christoph Koch, let's say, trot out. I mean, imagine, if you will, a biologist at that level coming up with a outlandishly counter theory to evolution and proposing that.
And then publishing an editorial in Nature about it. Exactly. Exactly.
This is exactly the facepalm that I do when I hear neuroscientists being, congratulating each other by essentially saying we know nothing about this high-level thing that is occurring, even though we know all these things about these low-level things that are occurring. because the idea is that these high-level things are built on top of these low-level things.
So,
well, go ahead.
A couple of questions from the audience too that I wanted to get in here at some point about the nature of understanding. Adam Ford asked, is consciousness required for understanding, or vice versa? Would Mary, in Mary's room, have understood the true nature of color before she left the grayscale room? Do we need a metaphysics of understanding? What is required for understanding?
let me. Okay, I'm going to throw myself out here, but let's. I think some, we're getting at some topics about, about physicalism, and is that the best scientific theory? So let me throw out. I want to use ethics instead of understanding, because I think it's maybe slightly easier to do that example. But clearly we have. I mean, we know. Like Ken was saying, I mean, you would really go out on a limb to deny evolution, and we know that we're social organisms. We know that we evolved ethics, to a large part to survive in a group, and we know all these things about ethics. But I think there's still the question of morality and things like that. That yes, we evolved. Obviously to have these systems and these views of disgust and right and wrong and all those kind of things. But is that the same thing as saying that there also isn't something called morality, which is say like something like mathematics? I mean, can we just reduce ethics completely to computation, or atoms, or the quantum wave function, or is there something out there? And I think that where I might differ with Ken is, I think those are, whether you want to call them questions in philosophy of science or metaphysics. I think you're going beyond the evidence when you're making some of those claims. I think you're making a metaphysical claim, which is a perfectly valid claim, but I don't think you can back that up, as science proves that. And I think that's a subtle point. I know you're going to hit me on that, but but I think that I think this gets it to really, really subtle points in philosophy of science.
Could I address the colorblind, Mary colorblind question there?
We can always talk about Mary's room.
Okay, but that was there was a specific question about that. And I just want to say that from my perspective, this is another example, like the Chinese room argument, of a misdirection. The thing that you're being asked to assume is that Mary can understand in some way everything about the color vision system. Now, if you really take that seriously, and let me take that seriously, what you're saying is that Mary, from my perspective, Mary is a computational system that is a self-modeling representational system that is the tip of the iceberg of a much larger subconscious system. It's built on top of this much larger subconscious system, which is where all the real action is occurring. And to assume that this tip of the iceberg system that is designed by evolution to make a summary of a person's actions in a kind of folk psychology way, assume that person can understand everything about the subconscious levels of their color system, of their color vision system, and then have them go outside and look at a red rose for the first time. Would they be surprised? It's nonsensical when you think of it that way. It's just like the Chinese room argument. You're being asked to assume that the thing that is that is so mysterious is a simple thing from a computational perspective, and it isn't. It isn't a simple thing from a computational perspective, and nobody could understand everything about it if they have a regular human mind. That mean. So what she would have is she would have a general idea of what color vision should feel like, and when she goes outside, of course, she would be surprised, because surprised in a certain number of ways and unsurprised in a certain other number of ways. But she would never have a complete understanding enough so that she wouldn't be surprised at anything. So well,
that's a fine sort of realist response, but it mostly sort of argues the thought experiment away. I mean, I think the question was just if you had essentially infinite kind of mechanical knowledge and yet had some sort of new experience the first time you saw a red thing, then the question is asking, does that imply that there is some further fact thing about qualia that you just could not capture by having even infinite mechanical knowledge of neural function or whatever? I think that's what the question is trying to pose.
Sorry. Yeah, but what Ken was saying is exactly right. It's if you really think about what that means, actually understanding, having full mechanical knowledge. And by the way, sorry, I turned off video to hopefully have better audio here.
It's working.
Then indeed, if you think the person can make a complete model that is the equivalent of the whole system, this whole processing system that exists in the visual system for color, then they would not be surprised.
Yeah.
Because they would know what the results would be, right? What they should experience.
Yeah. The way that I have posed, I think I have phrased in my own response to Mary's room, I think I'm basically posing Ken's answer, but I pose it a little bit differently. The way I've responded to Mary's room is to say that truly infinite knowledge of vision would basically consist of including in your infinite knowledge basically the neural encodings of all possible visual experiences. To actually study away the full mechanics of vision would be to write into your brain artificial red experiences. And that's why it wouldn't be surprising when you walk out of the room. You would have, your infinite mechanical knowledge would have essentially implanted false memories, essentially. Has always been kind of the only approach I had to Mary's room. And I think the only response to my response is we're not taking infinity seriously enough or something.
Yeah, or that what Mary would say is that I will be surprised. You know, it's not accepted. But I think that these are these thought experiments. I mean, hitting the thought experiments head on, which is another thing that Daniel Dennett does. Okay, I'm sure he did that on Mary's colorblind Mary as well. It just, you know, the proposed objections to a computational model of qualia and consciousness and self, they are, for lack of a better term, pathetic. Okay, they are. I mean, especially something like the Chinese room. You know, if it's a complete misdirection, it just it doesn't support. It shows how weak the other side of the argument is, and so it behooves us to ask: is there something better that you can put forward to support your belief that the underpinnings of neuroscience are so fundamentally flawed that we cannot even place a bet on whether this level of simulation would be sufficient.
Well, I think everyone here is in agreement with you, Ken. I think basically you have sort of brought to everyone's attention the fact that there's a significant population of the professional neuroscience community that is posing a frustrating challenge. And other than bringing it to our attention, I think we all sort of agree with you.
Yeah, of course, you know, the problem is that the four of us on the panel here are basically in agreement. So we get a lot of, we're trying to explain questions that come to us, but we're not really disagreeing with one another. But I think since we've spent a long time explaining why we think that many of the big questions that the questions that are frequently come our way are not the right questions, why these questions are not issues that really concern us when it comes to, is something like mind uploading possible? Perhaps we should explain to those who are listening which fundamental assumptions could be wrong that would undermine the possibility of successful mind uploading. So what sort of an argument, a challenge, a problem, a hurdle, a discovery would actually stand in the way? Or are we at the point where we can say, well, no, we know for a fact that mind uploading is possible?
I don't have a response to that.
Well, I mean, I think of if there's a metaphysical breakthrough in identity that somehow proves that that the whole way we think about it is incorrect. I mean, I don't know. Can't really say or even imagine what that would be. But if and it kind of I guess gets into the copy problem. If we're just thinking about identity in the wrong way, then that's a separate question. Would an upload be conscious? But you've always got that that skepticism with with the copy problem.
Well, I think there's practical issues that I would if I had to. I think essentially what you're saying, Randal, is if you were assigned to debate against mind uploading, what would be your best argument?
Correct. Exactly.
Okay. So, yeah, I dude, man, that would be awesome. I would love that challenge. I mean, I would have to approach it at multiple levels. I think the argument that you bring up, Randal, quite often, that there might be a level of complexity that essentially chaos theory type of complexity, where yes, yes, we can simulate weather, but we can't simulate weather more than a week in advance. And if we were to get 10 times better measurements and satellites and stuff, maybe we would push that to 2 weeks in advance. But at some level, we're not going to be able to get any. It's an exponentially hard problem, and so that same thing could be the case with something as complex as a nervous system. You would have to define what you mean by success and failure, which is another thing that I think is a fundamental problem. But if you say success, let's define success for a second as what 50% of the population would accept for a brain surgery procedure, and say that brain surgery procedure had been successful for them. Okay, let's use that as a proxy for some level of success, and say, is it possible that the complexity of the biological nervous system is such that you would have to get so much detail out of that in order to simulate it, that just like the weather, you would end up with a simulation that could only work 2 weeks in advance, but maybe for mind, it would only work 200 milliseconds in advance.
Right. Yeah.
That it wouldn't get phenomena like, yeah.
I like that you're bringing in this difference between something that is theoretically possible and something that is practically possible or is feasible, because that's, of course, always going to be important. Now, of course, this isn't the debate that we're having with neuroscientists or others, because the debate there is generally about, is it theoretically possible?
Although I that debate from neuroscientists, that particular, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes neuroscientists, indeed, they bring up that exactly. You're right. Neuroscientists are the ones that do get into that practicality problem. And I spend an awful lot of time thinking exactly about that problem, about how do you get to the first upload and what are the practical issues there, and then all sorts of stuff comes up. But it also raises, as you pointed out, the question of what is a successful mind upload, and that always becomes, you always come back to that question when discussing with people. Well, what would make this impossible, or why is it possible? And then that involves all the stuff we started talking about a little bit, like scale separation, or what is the degree of precision with which you have to duplicate what would be going on. And you mentioned being able to predict 2 weeks in advance what the system would be producing. Now, I mean, we can say that may be even very optimistic, that it might be hard to predict a second in advance.
That is the analogy of weather.
Right.
Saying that it might be 200 milliseconds in advance from a brain simulation point of view, and that would be unacceptable.
But of course, you immediately bump into the what is acceptable question again, because even if you cannot predict 200 milliseconds in advance exactly what it would be, because the biological system itself isn't that predictable at all, then there's still a range of things that you would consider acceptable versus a range of things that you would consider unacceptable. So things that would fall within the possible evolutions of the system, as opposed to the ones that shouldn't be happening. And that's where it really gets into the nitty-gritty of defining what's successful and what's not successful, I think.
So I'm interested if there's other strong arguments against that, people would put out. If they were put on the spot on the other side, debate the other side.
Well,
at whatever level.
Well, I mean, the thing that comes up all the time that is sort of my main thing. We haven't brought it up, and I'd love to actually have one workshop where we don't bring it up, but you asked. So, the big challenge that always comes up.
Moderators can moderate me if they want.
The big problem, the big question that always comes up with mind uploading, other than whether it works, whether it's conscious, is just the whole copy problem. And I don't know if we even want to, maybe we should just say we're going to have one workshop, but we're just not going to talk about it. But that is definitely the seminal objection after you get past the people who are unsure whether it'll be a zombie or something like that. There's no doubt that that's just front and center as far as the concerns.
So the copy problem, though, so my answer to the copy problem is, yeah, you can have many copies.
You can wrap it up with a bow for us, are you?
Yeah, so is the copy problem at what level is that an objection?
The copy problem as posed is, I'll just say it the way they say it with all the sort of loosey terminology that I find so painful, which is if you perform a mind upload, it's just a copy. The original dies in the body. And people will often put a disclaimer. They'll say, okay, well, I mean, that's better. I'd rather have a copy of me go on than not. They say, okay, there's a practical argument in favor of this as a procedure, but it doesn't count toward the metaphysical goal. It's not a survival. What Randal and I have refined the terminology in recent years in our own writings, and they would say that it's not a preservation or survival of personal identity. They don't say it that way because they don't use the precise phrasing that Randal and I have tried to sort of encourage. But nevertheless, that's what it comes down to. So the fact that you're okay with multiple copies is actually sort of, it's not for or against. It's just sort of like a lot of them are okay with multiple copies, but they just don't think it satisfies that particular goal. It's just some other goal, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Now, all that I'm saying is it's a very weird type of objection because it gets it doesn't say what's going to be missing. Or maybe it does. Maybe it says personal identity is not going to be the same, but then it doesn't say what that.
Yeah, I don't know. There are several thrusts to it. There's
I'm trying to if I was going to debate that, I guess I want to know what I would debate.
Yeah. So some people bring up what Parfit calls body identity. They're actually worried about the fact that it's not the same set of atoms. A lot of people sort of quickly move on from that to the whole sort of ship of Theseus and trading out with nanobots, and it all sort of gets quagmired. But then the other major concern is preserving some sort of existential stream of consciousness. And
right.
As you've seen in the past, I have definitely brought forth, sort of my arguments on that as best as I can. mostly what I'm doing right here, right now, is just sort of, I am right now kind of bringing that in their own terms. I'm trying to be as honest as I can in portraying, you know, in a non-derogatory sense. I'm trying to just sort of speak on their behalf to bring their counter argument, because you asked sort of what are the other objections, and I'm trying to mix it in here.
Yeah.
Well, I think that I mean, it kind of gets back to you know, the difference between first person and third person. I think people who would object to the you know, to the copy, well, the duplicate would say that you know, okay, granted, you've got you got perfect third person identity, but I'm doubting that you have first person identity. And the way I would address that is, well, you know, that's a metaphysical claim. So, you know, that comes with a lot of other metaphysical implications. So if you know, I mean, I guess that's how I would try to address the, you know, in a debate.
There's a question that's come up in the chat a couple times that actually speaks directly to that. Then from that point, is metaphysics applied to mind or consciousness falsifiable? And then the follow-up, if it's not, then how do you know you're making
well, I guess
metaphysics?
That gets back to, I guess, what Keith and I were talking about, like, how do we, you know, is there progress in metaphysics, and you know, how do you ever know? And you know, obviously, it's not like science; you don't ever prove something, you know, metaphysically. But you know, but it doesn't mean that there aren't, you know, arguments and, you know, strong versus, you know, weaker metaphysical arguments. But by definition, I think if something's a metaphysical question, then, you know, it's not going to be answered empirically, and so you're never going to, you know, have the kind of definitive, you know, answer that you do in you know, with a scientific question.
I've often felt that a lot of the questions about personal identity and preservation, survival, especially with respect to mind uploading, I think a lot of it comes down to each and every individual person sort of coming up with their own preferred metaphysics, and it's essentially a choice that we all make. You know, some people will choose to reject mind uploading because they have chosen to adopt a certain metaphysics model, and you can't talk them out of it. They've just they've bought into, and you can't talk them out of it on the basis of being wrong either. They've just chosen a view of the world that's not right or wrong, but it's just a view which precludes this you know, sort of theoretical futuristic procedure that we're all interested in. Randal has challenged me on this, right? And he did a good job of it a long time ago. I said, you know, I was sort of I said, maybe we just have to take first person claims at face value. I sort of buy into the fact that it might just be a choice, and you can only argue about it up to a point, but ultimately everybody gets to make their own decision, and therefore you should honor first person claims, which has often been, you know, that's sort of the underpinning of my response to the copy problem, is everybody's first person claims just sort of win, and you don't argue about it beyond that point. And Randal made the good point that, of course, facetiously, you could design a two-line computer program that just emits the sentence, "I am conscious." And he was absolutely right that, you know, no reasonable metaphysical model would accept that. So the answer can't be a full buy-in of the personal choice, which I like. I'm glad that there has to be something grounded in there. And I guess a lot of what I do is try to find where is that point in the middle that is the closest to truth, because the extremes don't seem to capture it.
But there's still a difference between the two kinds of objection or question. I mean, one of them is the question, could you create a conscious emulation of me, or something that is like me and is conscious? And that's where this question of, well, do we accept it at face value, or do we go further, where that comes in? And yeah, we'd like to go a little further. We'd like the model to be able to behave the way that you would behave as well, and things like that. And you have to set up a bunch of criteria for what is a successful relation. But that doesn't take away the copy problem directly, because when people talk about the copy problem, they're talking about things like, okay, let's assume a hypothetical scenario where you could actually create a copy of my brain while my brain remains untouched and undamaged and I continue to exist. Now, obviously, that other brain, that's not me, because I'm still here. So how could you possibly claim that creating a copy of my brain keeps me alive and I'm still there?
And of course, the answer is branching identity.
Right. That's exactly what you're saying in your book. Yeah.
Which I guess I don't think I'll actually present the whole thing right here, right now. Most of our viewers, I mean,
well,
I could.
you don't have to, but
Yeah,
I do think it would be wrong of us when we're having a workshop about the metaphysics of mind uploading to avoid talking about the thing that gets asked the most. I think we definitely do need to talk about it.
Right. So, in brief summary, what branching identity claims is, and the way that one way I claim it is just sort of to honor first-person subject claims. So I say that all descendant minds of a common ancestral mind, share primacy in their claim to the original identity. It's sort of it's topically very specific, so it comes out a little precise, but that's how I've always phrased it. And then the other way to sort of define what branching identity is just that you have this identity which sort of represents some confluence of memories or stream of consciousness. Streams of consciousness obviously break in ways that people sometimes don't readily recognize or acknowledge. We have this thing that we're calling a personal identity. And if at any point in time there come into existence two physical systems which happen to encode sort of the same memory history, then that just defines a branching point in that personal identity. And from that point forward, the multiple physical agents, brains, and the multiple minds and identities associated with them, they don't share consciousness or any of this silliness that often sort of gets thrown in for some reason that I can't quite figure out. But they just represent entirely equally valid continuations of sort of the identity that existed at some point in the past. It has no physical dependency, which is why the various branches get equal primacy of that identity. I'm not sure if I actually threw that together in the smoothest way that I have when I have a chance to sort of think through my writing, but that's the branching identity claim. And I'm persistently incredulous at how frustrating that claim seems to be for many people, because it seems fairly good to me. Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, but I want to just reiterate Randal's question, just to give you another shot at a crystal clear answer to this. So if somebody says, this whole mind uploading procedure could theoretically be done before I'm dead, or it could result in two simultaneous mind uploads, and so there can't be two of me. So obviously there's a problem here. This is a proof by contradiction.
So I reject phrasings that sort of move forward in time instead of backward in time. I don't think you're allowed to say, here I am at time t, which future person am I? I don't even think you're allowed to ask, which future person do I become? I think that these are, there's something wrong in the phrasing of the question, and I admit that it's sort of a pursuit of my writing to try to clarify what's wrong about that, but there's something wrong there. It is fair to ask the question backward in time. So you are here now, and you can ask who you were in the past, and you can have a situation where two people ask that question and they come up with the same answer. And that's it. That's branching identity. You can ask it backwards, and you can't ask it forwards. And the best explanation I can come up with, the best excuse I can come up with for why we should be prohibited from asking the question forward in time is to say there's something grossly wrong in our conception of time to say that we can speculate on a future that doesn't exist. When we're saying, which future person will I become, we're asking about, I think we're basically saying something that's nonsense, and we haven't quite teased apart the fact that our language is letting us pose something ridiculous.
I think it's a good point about backwards versus forwards. And part of it is that, in a sense, just in terms of probabilities, we already have a branching problem if you're going to look forward in time. Because as we mentioned before, nothing in the brain and how the brain works is so predictable that we could say in advance exactly what our brain states are going to look like 200 milliseconds from now. That means that there is already a probability distribution of who we're going to be in 200 milliseconds. So if you're going to look forwards, you've already got a branching problem of sorts, even if you're not making any copies, even if you're not making any simulations. So all you can do is 200 milliseconds in the future is you can say you can look back, I derived from this me 200 milliseconds before. That's one way of looking at it, but you know that that doesn't actually answer the problem that people have, which is really the question of, you know, I'm alive right now, I'm experiencing myself as I am here, but if you make a copy of me over there, I'm still going to die.
But yeah, and of course you can always throw it around. You can say, if I make a copy over there, then I'm going to see my old body suddenly. And why did I suddenly see my old body on the other side of the room? Right? You can try to get people to sort of shake up their thought process by turning the question around on them. Is the best I've come up with, you know. So in a teleportation scenario, people say in a non-destructive teleportation, they say, you know, I walked into the teleporter and I walked out of the teleporter and it didn't work. So, you know, that proves it doesn't work. And I always just, one of the first things I do is just turn it around on them. You walk into the teleporter and you walk out on Mars and you know it did work, and all you know is that your body's left over on Earth, and that's your perspective. That's your perspective. That's not a copy's perspective. That's not somebody else's perspective. You can just say, my perspective was I walked in and then I walked out on Mars, and apparently there's some copy back on Earth of me. And that is my best response, is to try to just state the fact that there are these other subjective perspectives, and you've got to buy into the real visceral experience of all the minds and people involved.
Yeah, but what we can see here is that it really does, in the end, revolve around a common perception that there is an uninterrupted stream of consciousness, and that if you were to interrupt it, if one of those is interrupted, then you're gone. So the moment when you make a copy, sure, that copy of you lives on, great, but your stream of consciousness ends at your death. And you know, that's based on this bizarre, not bizarre, maybe for most people it's totally normal, but to me it seems bizarre. This bizarre concept that there is an uninterrupted stream of consciousness, and that is how we define ourselves, because so many studies can show clearly that our consciousness is definitely not an uninterrupted stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
So we have another question from the audience. Tangentially related, PJ Manny asked, what about Damasio's insistence on mind-body feedback loops? Are we assuming a simulation of bodily functions?
Well, I think the answer would be yes. We are assuming simulation of bodily functions. So it's essentially a non-issue.
Wow, a lot of debate here. All right. Regarding continuity, does cell division help? When a cell divides, which one is the original?
Ooh, that's a good comparison there.
Well, I think it's a good question, because the answer to that is there's no answer, and we're okay with accepting that. And when I'm presented with the copy problem, I often say, well, frame exactly what you just said about C3PO. And you know, can you imagine that C3PO is conscious? Yeah, okay, I can kind of imagine that. Can you imagine C3PO being turned off? You know, what is his experience of being turned off? Oh yeah, they turned him off in the movie. And, you know, he just didn't have any conscious experience at that point. Can you imagine him being turned on again? Yes. Then he comes back to consciousness. Can you imagine him being turned off, you know, copied, you know, so that his disk drive was put on to C3PO and they were both turned on? And if which one is going to be C3PO at that point? And if they say it doesn't matter, then the question is, why does it matter about us? And if the answer is it matters dramatically about us, but it doesn't matter about C3PO, then that is a scientific claim that if true, probably eats through a whole bunch of science. You know, so it's like, wow, what if there is this thing? This was, I was trying to talk to Michael Cerullo about this at some point. It's like, well, let's assume that you're right, that there is this fundamental, humongous difference between you and an exact copy of you. You know, what does that mean? Does that mean physicalism is wrong? Because you wouldn't have this same issue with C3PO and a copy of C3PO.
Do you know what the answer was when you asked that?
It was not a clear answer. If you wish a clear answer, he doubles and triples and quadruples down in his book. And I was very surprised to read page after page after page in his book about the copy problem, and hanging his objection to mind uploading on the copy problem as opposed to any. I mean, again, if I was going to debate the mind uploading, I mean, the first thing I would do is what I said, Randall. I would take your argument. The second thing I would do is I would start to pick apart what we know about neuroscience. I would say that, hey, there's, here is the level of experiments that we have performed, and there is this gulf between where we're usually talking about behavior and memory and experience and an overall system, and there could be some serious unknowns in that gulf. So if I had to be put on the other side and debate the heck out of mind uploading, brain preservation, all this other stuff, the copy problem would be way down on my list, because I know that I would be just shooting myself in my foot. It's just not it's an argument that is obviously coming from personal bias. To me, I know that's a strong statement, but there you go.
No, bias is how I characterize it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I stepped away for a second. I thought the question was about embodiment, and then I came back and you were talking about C3PO. Did I miss something?
There was a second question about can't you, if you have two cells, if a cell divides, which one is the original?
Oh, okay, yeah, I missed that.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a great point. And this starts to lead into a slightly different question, that we might call the ethics of mind uploading, which is, so the copy problem, those of us who are inclined to think in terms of streams of consciousness and how they turn off and on anyway, and we don't really mind that this problem, isn't really a problem to us, we'll say, okay, mind uploading is something that's going to happen at some point. As long as neuroscience keeps plodding along and neural engineering keeps plodding along, we should assume that the end result at some point will be that something like whole brain emulation is possible, and therefore mind uploads of some or some similar artificial intelligence will be itself as much as it wants to. So something like mind uploading is going to exist, assuming that civilization still exists in a while. But then you have to you have to acknowledge that there are going to be those who either don't have access to this technology or who choose not to, because for them something like the copy problem is going to be a fundamental issue. So then you end up with what you might call a sort of split in the species where some decide to go with it and some decide not to go with it. And then you have to start wondering about what this society is going to look like. What happens when you have the possibility of mind uploading, but not everyone chooses to go there.
But there's an end result to that. So
Right.
there's a split, but actually what you have is a selection event.
Okay, so you can see how this
one generation later, everybody believes in mind uploading.
And you can see how this might be an ethics question about mind uploading. Is it, how does this affect our society? Is it responsible for us to be doing something that may be leaving half or more of the population behind and supplant them eventually? Is this in any way less dangerous than, say, the questions people are posing about AI takeovers and stuff like that? And I'm saying facetiously because I personally I'm not on that side, but
Well, I guess you're right. I mean, I'm the one who actually phrased it as a selection event, but actually now I think about it, it's only a selection event of exclusion, or it's only a selection event of elimination if the population that chooses not to upload, somehow died out. But that's, I mean, people have been not mind uploading for 2 million years and they haven't died out. So the ethics of leaving them behind doesn't quite apply. But you do have a selection where the problem goes away. Everyone who buys into mind uploading, is sort of happy with their choice, and everyone who doesn't makes their decision not to, and they're done with it. And then, the whole big question and decision and hemming and hawing and self-searching, at that point, it's all over. Everyone's made their decision. I guess the only way in which it would continually come up is from that other population, sort of new offspring might, sort of be making the decision to become uploaders, and that would be sort of jumping over the bridge periodically. But the huge societal upheaval where everybody has to make this decision, that kind of only happens kind of once, right? I mean, it's naive. I mean, it wouldn't actually happen that simplistically.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't even, like, when people ask me about it, I say it's probably not going to be a single event at a single time. It's more a gradual change where, people start to incorporate neuroprosthesis in their brains. And so part of them is already used to this whole new paradigm. And as we get more used to these ideas, more people start thinking about it the way that we happen to. And it's very hard to predict, especially when interacting with all the other stuff that happens around us. But it's still a question that gets asked a lot. So I appreciate your answer, and I think you're probably right. And then I don't want to jump ahead too far because I'm sure Ken still has a comment on that, and maybe Michael does too. But then we eventually get into these questions about, well, what about these other things, like how does this address the gap between, say, the development of AI and humanity and all this other stuff? There's a lot that we can't possibly predict, but we can speculate about a little bit. But anyway, let Ken have a word here.
Well, I don't think I have much to say, but the thing that would scare me is the philosophical zombie apocalypse. Where everybody thinks that uploading works, but everybody becomes a phenomenologically a zombie. I don't put any weight in that either, but if I was on the other side, that would be a real apocalypse. The conscious light in the universe would go out because people were thinking that it was a good thing.
But but the people who buy into that, they would just be like, okay, you idiots, go off and erase your consciousness, and we'll stay over here and not upload, and we'll carry the light for you or something. I mean, unless they felt there was some sort of war to fight over it, then they would just be like, okay, well, you're a bunch of unconscious idiots, go do your thing, right?
But those darn kids, they all want to be uploaded.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
And they're just going to ruin my heritage. They're just going to become phenomenological zombies. That's what I keep telling them, but they're not listening to me.
And on that note, obviously we are running over. I hate to interrupt this, but I do want to respect your speaker's time. How could you possibly improve over that? That was beautiful. But no, I did want to give people an opportunity to bow out or make any final statements.
But you're not saying that we have to quit at this point, right? It's just a sort of an option. Like, this is the point where your obligation ends, right?
Right. Yes. Everyone is free to go home.
Okay.
We will
Because
unchain
I personally still did have a question I'd like to ask people if they're still on.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so again, this is maybe beyond what you're comfortable talking about, but since we started on the topic, and Ken already pointed out one example, the philosophical zombie apocalypse, I'm wondering what each of you thinks might be, a challenging potential downside of a society into which mind uploading is introduced. What might be a potential downside, since we're kind of the advocates of this?
Well, I think Robin Hanson in his book *The Age of M* kind of made me realize, because he talked a lot about clans, and once you start, he's like talking about workers. Like once you start uploading, then people aren't going to not have jobs. You're just going to have different kinds of jobs, and the most efficient workers will be copied over and over again, and so you just end up with a couple of clans of copies of pretty boring personalities that just want to work and work and work. So that kind of made me think a little bit about what there's a lot of unknowns about this scenario when it's people can just copy personalities, and we can't ignore economics, because there may be a lot of pressures and evolutions, and things may not be the kind of utopia that those of us that advocate for uploading have in mind, because certainly his picture of just a few large clans of these very efficient workers is not really the greatest outcome, at least from my perspective.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I know that Robin, when I spoke to him about it, he didn't actually see his outcome as a negative, as a societal problem. But I do actually. I'm if I see when I read his book, I felt like it was an apocalyptic version of mind uploading.
I thought it was pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
The frustrating thing about Robin Hanson's phrasing is he seems to be entirely comfortable in regarding not only AI, but uploaded humans as, he treats them almost as if they're unconscious, but he doesn't really call it that. He just calls it, he regards them as tools, and just sort of the fact that it represents a sort of slavery just kind of like passes on by, or did I miss that?
But he's asking some good questions, like if you subject someone to 24 hours of work, but then you erase their memory of that, does it really count? There's those sorts of things. Of course, this sort of stuff has been treated in philosophy before, and I'm definitely in the camp where I say, yeah, it kind of matters, because it's really more about what you're subjecting them to at the time. It's not about whether they have a memory of it. It's just the same. It's the same question as date rape drugs, right?
But what if the upload does it to themselves, though? What if they intentionally?
They voluntarily go into it, yeah. And then you have to start asking questions like, if there are billions of copies of the proficient worker who just likes to do their stuff, does that really matter? Is this of any consequence? And so are numbers important? If there are 4 billion, 50 billion, a trillion great worker mind uploads, and they just like doing that, and there are maybe only 5 million other mind uploads that go out and explore the galaxy and enjoy themselves, is this actually an ethical problem, or is it just fine? But let's set that aside for a second. My bigger issue with his version of the future would be that he's really just taken today, with today's economics and the absence of AI, and has just put in there the availability of mind uploading. And that doesn't seem at all realistic to me, because, of course, if you're going to have uploads, then why wouldn't you have AI of another kind that could do all sorts of jobs that are very similar? So it just seems like a very unlikely future to me.
It's true. It seems like with a little bit more technology, and I don't mean a few decades, but a century or two, when we get to the point where we can manipulate brains and minds, and by brain I mean a computerized sort of version of a brain, where we can basically manipulate the physical underpinnings of minds, with tremendous ease. What that implies all sorts of things that do have to be taken seriously with regard to ethics, because one of the reasons that biological brains are safe from a wide variety of these sorts of problems is that you can't just make a copy of them. You can't store them for 1,000 years. You can't just sort of subject them in these ways. And even the mere possibility of just sort of working across a huge set of brains in the way that we currently work across a couple of spreadsheets or something. What does it come down to? It comes down to the ability to own and then do whatever you want with a whole pile of consciousnesses, instead of a whole bunch of sort of computer files or things. What happens when that becomes incredibly feasible? And as you said, this comes up in sci-fi so much, I'm not sure we can actually.
But it's super relevant. In fact, I think that Ken may have asked a question that was very similar, which is, if we have success criteria for mind uploading, and we're applying verification methods, we have a certain validation test for what is, how well does this particular emulation match what is supposed to be going on, and do we have to iterate back and improve the emulation and create a better version? What happens to all of the emulations that don't quite meet the success criterion? What do you do? Do you just turn them off? Is that totally ethically fine? What do you do with them? And when I sort of read that question, I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, and Ken, you can elaborate. But I didn't exactly know what to do with that.
Yeah, and I think at a deeper level, when people start running into those issues, people are going to do what they would typically do. They're going to delete those mods, and this poses, like I said, a deeper ethical issue, because when we start to really understand what we are and be able to manipulate it, then the existential crisis will be in full force. This is my fear. Okay, the original question was, what do you fear about a society? And the way I kind of let me put it as bleakly as I possibly can. Okay, when we were hunter gatherers, our minds were built for hunter gathering. There weren't a lot of people that jumped off of cliffs because they were out to get their next meal. And as we become more and more and more understanding that we're just computational beings, and that have been programmed by evolution to desire to flip certain switches that are inside of our skull that we don't have access to, because evolution didn't give us access to those switches. But now we can go in, because of mind uploading, and flip those switches all we want. At some level, you start to say, I was programmed by evolution to be, a slave chasing a carrot, and what's the point? And I think we can look forward and see that there is not going to be a point. We're not going to find a point to existence, and so I could imagine that this mind uploading world, you're asking for a bleak scenario, so I'm giving you one. I could imagine that this mind uploading world ends in mass suicide, because we just realized that we were all along, we were just designed by evolution to procreate, because because that's the only purpose.
Yeah, but there's always going to be some variation, right? There are going to be some people who just don't care as much about these existential crises, and they're not going to suicide. So if you're going to pose that as the major problem, which I agree it could be, then you still have, again, a selection event, right?
Yeah, someone will be happy to watch reruns of Friends for the next 1,000 years. I actually wrote an article about this, and I didn't, I sort of came to the conclusion that ultimately, sort of heat death of the universe implies that it really actually is all for nothing. I do sort of buy into the ultimate nihilism, but it takes 1 trillion years to get there, so I'm not too worried about it. But, my conclusion on sort of the purpose of existence really is nothing more than the persistence of conscious minds. I think that the point of consciousness is to keep consciousness going so that the physical universe has consciousness in it, because consciousness is the only darn thing that gives the universe any purpose. And you're right, Ken, a lot of people won't be satisfied that their tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of conscious contribution is enough, and they'll be depressed. And we call those people religious, and that's how they solve that problem today. They've been solving that problem for 1,000 years in the exact same way, and they may continue to solve it. No matter how much we take the brain apart or even decide that it can be physically, sort of a substrate converted, I suspect that religion will survive. Some sort of substance dualism will be sort of inserted into the discussion, and the soul's going to ride it. So there will be people who will solve the problem by sort of keeping religion around, and then there will be people who solve the problem the way I do, which is by saying keeping consciousness going, to keep consciousness going, to keep consciousness going is a good enough reason. And
yeah, but this is kind of making this is. I think you're giving too little credit to what is possible. So, if boredom is not going to be a problem because we can program boredom out. Okay.
But your concern was that when we define
suicidal tendencies, right? You can say just program out the decision or the possibility to decide to suicide.
That's right. We can do any of these things, and so it's. I guess what I'm saying is that all of these scenarios could end up bleakly. Suicide is bleak, but also just being satisfied watching the same rerun over and over again because you're satisfied watching the same rerun over and over again. You've taken those circuits and gotten rid of the boredom circuits.
I'm finding this a little bit. This is a problematic way for us to go into the discussion, I think, because we're putting forward things like what is a bleak scenario, and that assumes that everybody agrees what is bleak, whereas some people might think that what you're calling bleak isn't bleak. But I'm kind of interested to know, what is your not bleak scenario for a future with mind uploading?
Me personally?
Yeah, you personally.
Well, I mean, okay. Let me just finish the thought that I think there are people that make a good argument that human beings are evolved for being hunter-gatherers, if you will, and that going too far away from that may be suboptimal from some kind of moral perspective. So I think that is a perspective that some people have. Now, what do I think? Obviously I'm into this because I want to visit the stars. I want to, understand, the connection between general relativity and quantum mechanics in a way that would, beat any current physicist alive today. I want to do all the things that I can't possibly do at this point, and that would be an awesome experience for me. And once I get to that level, I would hopefully find other challenges to enjoy.
So you're not bothered by the existential crisis?
No, I'm not personally bothered by it, but I might. But at the same time, I might be fooling myself. And if somebody comes along with that argument, because I'm trying to, you know, I get arguments from different perspectives, and there's some arguments that I recognize as, you know, you have an argument, it's a good argument. I don't have a good answer to that argument. I don't agree with that, but I still don't have a good answer to that argument. I don't want to like force a good answer to it. Yeah, and the existential one is one that I don't have a good answer to.
No, that's good. I mean, I think it's a great answer. I personally don't have an issue with the existential crisis question either. I just don't have that.
I admit that it bothers me, but I also concede that it doesn't need to be solved today. There's a lot of time left to figure it out. So even though I think it's sort of a legitimate statement about sort of reality, it doesn't, like, I don't know, there's just so much time to figure it out. I don't care.
But, I mean, to put it in a nutshell, Keith, your question is really, what's the purpose? What are we here for, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll find, I think you're going to just find camps where some care about that question and some just don't. Yeah, but it's but you know, you kind of sort of started slipping into another problematic issue, at least from an ethical point of view, which is this: if we compare mind uploading as a life extension method, which it's often seen as, I personally tend to talk about it more as being adaptable and stuff, but people present it as a life extension method, and especially the Brain Preservation Foundation looks at it as a life extension possibility. And you compare it with other life extension possibilities, ways of just trying to extend your life biologically. A big difference here, besides the copy problem, is that when we're talking about mind uploading, we're talking about gaining an understanding of who we are, how our minds work, how what we consider ourselves works, and being able to change it and augment it and become adaptable and do all sorts of things that we couldn't do before. And what I think that people sometimes put up as a problem with that is that it maybe isn't the same thing as simply extending our lives, because if you change too much, then are you still there? Is this actually something completely different that you've become? So that's, if I would put up a challenge or potential downside, there's the question of, are you really actually extending your life, or is it you know, are you just modifying to something completely different?
But yeah, and the same claim would come up in conventional biological, just sort of Methuselah immortality. You know, anyone who just managed to stay alive for 10,000 years would, by any reasonable definition, just not be the same person. And you just have to sort of mix that into your acceptance of extended lifespans and sort of roll with it somehow.
Good point.
Yeah, I always think of this from a kid to grown-up perspective. It's like, you know, we don't consider a 10-year-old. I have an 11-year-old. I can look at my 11-year-old and absolutely know that in 10 years, that 11-year-old is going to be unrecognizable. And yet, that is a good thing, and it's the whole purpose to see that type of growth. And so you know, I think of you come back from brain preservation, you get uploaded, and within a year or two, you've grown just like you would grow from being an 11-year-old to a 21-year-old. And should that be considered a bad thing? No, that should be considered a good thing.
Yeah. Except the example you're giving is more like a well-known metamorphosis, right? It's like we already know what adults are typically like, and you know that your 11-year-old is going to become something like an adult. The 11-year-old is not going to be something completely different than a human adult. Whereas in the case of mind uploading and being able to make whatever alterations you want and maybe benefit from all sorts of AI brain constructs, you could become something that no one has ever seen before, right?
But if the critical aspect of identity is essentially memories, then yeah, you can add tentacles to your robotic body, you can be able to see ultraviolet, but really what what matters in the question of whether extended life represents some sort of dissolution of your identity is just the retention of memories. And Thomas Reid, wrote about this 300 years ago. I mean, old people may have next to no memories of their childhood, and we just don't regard that as death, or if we do, it doesn't bother us. And you're right that mind uploading just sort of makes the potential for changes more overt. But the problem has always been there. We've always recognized that old people and the children they came from are, like, there's no real meaningful.
It kind of sounds like what you're saying is whatever we're used to is okay and is normal, and whatever we're not used to is maybe what we're worrying about. But so we're used to old people being very different than infants, and maybe 80-year-olds not remembering what they knew when they were 2. And yet we think that's totally okay because it's simply the way things are.
Yeah. So all that I would add is that let's say nobody gets brain preserved, nobody gets mind uploaded today, but 200 years from now, that is the thing that happens. You're going to get people that start as babies. At some level, they're going to have 0, and they're going to go to whatever this top level is, or whatever, and so they're going to go through that progression just the way we would go through that progression. And so if they're going through their progression is considered horrific, not the same person, et cetera, et cetera. Only in that case should we consider brain preservation and mind uploading being, not a life extension. If the stuff that's happening in 200 years from now is considered okay, then jumping forward in a portal to that should also be considered okay. Does that make sense at all? That probably I would draw the nonsense that I just said.
We're at almost 3.5 hours.
Sorry.
All right. Again, of course, everyone is free to leave at this point, right? We're just talking now because we still have interesting things to talk about.
I think I was just wondering if this is the culmination of 3 hours of metaphysical musing.
That's fine.
Not being coherent anymore.
Yeah.
And Jesse, do we have any new questions or questions that never made it to the surface? Or
we don't have any new questions. There was a question or two that were not completely clear. So I think at this point, I think at this point we can call it. We can keep going. People who want to drop off can drop off. We should wrap up now, and thank our audience for joining.
I think we're pretty close. I personally try to explicitly address one more point because it's important to me, which is, what we talk about here, this whole workshop, whole brain emulation, mind uploading, all the theories behind it, the philosophy and science of consciousness, all of that stuff is not mainstream. For some reason that isn't entirely, because I came through the whole educational upbringing of neuroscience and into neural engineering, and it seemed completely logical to me that connects to everything we're talking about today. For many neuroscientists and neural engineers, that's not necessary. I'm really curious, what is the act between neuroscience, neural engineering, and whole brain emulation, and what is the problem that we have as to why what we're talking is still so fringe?
You're asking why it remains fringe?
Well, I'm kind of asking why is it fringe? Given that it seems to me like a natural, it's one of those things that you would naturally expect to come out of the science of neuroscience and neural engineering, is that eventually we would be building emulations of entire brains. This seems like a natural endpoint, or not an endpoint, but one of those directions that it would naturally take. So I'm wondering, if it seems so natural to me, why is this still a fringe thing?
So there must be one of, off the top of my head, I see two major sort of reasons why people would resist it. One is this just sort of concern over the nature of consciousness. They just, people who just, the raw physicalist, functionalist, reductionist view is just challenging. The other problem is a completely different take on it, which is the ethical thing. They just, it's not whether they think it's possible or not, they're just deeply concerned that it will destroy society or something. I suspect it's one of those two, unless there's a third angle in the whole thing.
Well, I would suggest that most people just think that it's just so far in the future that it's not worth discussing.
So they're not for or against it. They just think that we're taking them way too seriously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, here's an interesting thing. Actually, Andy just sent me an article today where they did actually a big survey about people's attitudes about, whether they disagree or agree with mind uploading. And one was interesting was that there's a big correlation between ethical concepts of disgust. So purity concerns and sexual disgust were very highly correlated with disagreeing with uploading. And naturally, you predict that they created this science fiction scale. So people who are exposed to these kind of ideas are more positive. And that explained gender difference, actually. So it wasn't that men and women are different on this view. That's explained by how much exposure they have to these kind of ideas.
Right. So you're saying that we got a corner on the perverted sci-fi market. All
exactly.
Right.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
We're setting up a booth at Comic-Con.
What else was interesting about that? Here's what you might not have guessed. So whether or not people agree or disagree with uploading is not related to the act of transfer. So they did one study was whether you transfer it to a monkey, one you transfer it to a computer, one you transfer it to whatever. That didn't make any difference on what people agreed or disagreed with it. So I don't know. That's interesting that there, maybe it'll be an area of empirical research about what, because obviously I think we're all on the same page. This seems like a perfectly natural, extension.
I mean, if people are talking about colonizing other stars, there's people that talk about colonizing other stars, and I guess there would probably be a lot of people that would, it's just not something that, professional people at NASA would want to spend a lot of time even speculating on. Right, and you'll get a bunch of people that say, "Well, we're never going to do that." As the human race is never going to, figure that out. I chalk it up to the same level of kind of this is way, way too futuristic to even bother with discussing.
Mm-hmm.
And people that don't understand how futuristic it is.
When I think about what people's opposition to it is, and this is actually how I kind of tend to approach the topic when I talk to a neuroscientist about it, is I kind of put that in as a caveat that yes, of course, this is really far in the future, and I understand that most people don't think it's doable, blah, blah, blah. It's exactly that. It's the professionalism aspect. People want to, in my experience, I'm just saying this is my theory about how they react, is they'll put forward that yes, they're critical and skeptical about it because they're a professional and they're trying to be professional and perceived as professional. It's partly, of course, them interpreting what does the general public, what does everyone else think about it. So they're modeling how, if I say I agree with this stuff or think it's cool, versus how will I be perceived if I come across as highly skeptical. and then highly skeptical comes up top because it just looks like it's going to be the better the better thing to say if you want to be perceived as a serious professional. And that has very little to do with what they actually think about it in terms of scientific plausibility or feasibility, etc. So that's what I normally think. But that article that you pointed out, Michael, that's interesting. I read it too, and interesting points in there, especially how the gender gap just disappears when you look at sci-fi as being the explaining factor. But I also had to caution myself as I was reading it, thinking, well, this is one of those studies where the way that that the study was presented to people, what information they had in advance, and what sort of questions were being asked, all of that matters an awful lot to the responses that you get. But that said, it's a pretty good semblance, I suppose, a pretty good summary of what would happen when you just approach just any group at any moment in random and start talking to them about mind uploading and ask them what they think. Very interesting article.
Yeah, it was interesting because I think that was the first real social science research I've ever seen that's actually looking at this topic. So hopefully there'll be more of those kinds of studies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, Jesse. That was my last question. If we have nothing else, I guess you could close up.
All right. Then, yeah.
Thank you, Randal, for putting this on.
Oh, thanks. But it wasn't really me. This time I'm mostly just a panelist. It's Jesse and Alan who really deserve the credit for this. They put in so much work just to make it happen.
Thank you, guys.
Yep. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Randal and Keith.
Great discussion.
Speakers,
Yeah.
nothing would have happened.
Well done.
And I do want to thank the volunteers, Alan, etc. Alan, you've been huge in making everything happen. And the audience, thank you guys for participating in this. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, good questions from the audience. Thank you, everyone.
The links are up, so please check out our links. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and your donations are always tremendously appreciated. And we're also always looking for more volunteers. We are also looking for satellite groups to join future workshops. And finally, of course, our survey. We'd love to get your feedback on what we can do better in the future. So thanks to everyone again, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right. Good night.
Bye-bye.